I was born in the same hospital in which Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. I apologize in advance that I have not been the same boon to mankind.
1, 2, 3, 4.
He's considered one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Spoken of in the same breath as Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, he's a master wordsmith and storyteller with an effortless talent for melody and an insatiable eclecticism. Declan Patrick McManus, best known by the name Elvis Costello, rose to prominence during the British punk and new wave explosion of the late 70s and went on to stretch his range into everything from country, soul, jazz, classical, R&B, and even hip-hop. He hasn't stopped stretching since. Today, almost 50 years after his debut, he has one of the most impressive discographies in popular music, and I want to rank his albums from worst to best. Hi folks, quickly interjecting to apologize for having to split the video in half. This was not my intention. I wanted the entire thing all the way to number 1 in one video, and I will eventually. This first half goes all the way to number 18. The second half will go all the way to number 1. I wanted the entire thing done in time for October 13th, and then this year just became too busy, and I especially have too much happening in October for that to be feasible anymore. But I still want to keep to my deadline, so apologies for that, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the first half of the list. My first album ranking video was of my favorite band, They Might Be Giants. It's 3 years old and I don't like it anymore. My YouTube career in a nutshell. But through TMBG, I eventually discovered Elvis Costello, who was a major influence of theirs. The band obviously took a few musical cues from his work, but more importantly, Elvis proved a decade before them that weird nerds with weird voices, clever lyrics, and eclectic influences had a place in pop music. By the latter half of my time in high school, Elvis solidified himself as my second favorite artist of all time, behind They Might Be Giants, and my number 1 favorite single musician. And after that first video, I want to do his work proper justice. Found it, by the way. I meant for this list to come out in August for Elvis's 70th birthday. Last year. But then my script ate itself and I had to start over. Luckily, the day this video goes public, October 13th, 2025, is the 10th anniversary of Elvis's memoir, and since it was a major source of research, that's equally fitting. Today also happens to be Margaret Thatcher's 100th birthday. Don't know if that was a coincidence. But more importantly, it's National No Bra Day. Fuck yeah, we're doing this! The TMBG video ran entirely on my own personal attachment to the band, with very little research beyond the fan wiki and whatever sources they linked. But shortly after I made it, lazy research and plagiarism had a burning hot light shined on them. A bomb, you might say. And that lit a fire under my ass to actually put in some serious research and reading this time to make this ranking worth a damn. I read almost every book about Costello I could get my hands on, from biographies to critical analyses to single album celebrations, and of course his memoir, plus several articles and interviews, if only to be sure I have as many perspectives and accurate details about these records as possible to properly flesh out these reviews. Coupled with the fact that They Might Be Giants have only 2/3 as many albums as Elvis at the time of filming, this is going to be a much denser video. But ultimately, the most important element is how I feel about each album, and with such a celebrated musician with such an acclaimed discography, it will deviate from how you feel. I am very curious to hear where fellow fans disagree with me, especially about the albums early on the list. Trust me, after a point, these placements get pretty damn arbitrary anyway. But that's the fun of an album ranking video like this. The actual ranking is the least important part. Let's lay down the ground rules for my list. I'm counting every full-length LP, but no EPs. It wouldn't be fair to judge them the same, and Elvis doesn't have very many to begin with. Some of them were effectively bonus tracks or outtakes from an LP's life cycle, in which case I've included them as basically part of those albums when they come up. This also includes expanded reissues, if I have anything to say about them. Sometimes I just don't. I'm not including live albums or compilations because those tend to be all or mostly existing album material, just in a separate package or with only a slightly different performance. However, there are 2 compilations and 1 live album that do not fit that description, and thus are exceptions to the rule and are included on the list. I'm also not counting his orchestral work or soundtrack collaborations because even though he scored them, generally he's not playing or singing on them. It'd be a very uneven and unfair comparison comparison with the studio albums. I'm also not including his latest release at the time of filming, The Coward Brothers with T-Bone Burnett, because although it is a full studio album, it's a soundtrack album to the audio series, and I haven't had anywhere the time to absorb it and ruminate on it as everything else. I did that with TMBG's book in the last ranking. I don't want to repeat that here. I want to keep this fair. Aside from that, every studio album is on the list, be it Elvis solo with a backing band, a collaboration with another artist, and even his covers albums, totaling a hefty 33 records for me to rank and review. But before we start with number 33, I need to introduce you to his two primary backing bands, The Attractions and The Imposters. The Attractions are keyboardist Steve Naive, bassist Bruce Thomas, and drummer Pete Thomas, obligatory no relation comment. They were formed to support Elvis's first album on tour in 1977, supposedly inspired by Bob Dylan's work with the band, who were one of Elvis's favorite bands. And they stuck around with him off and on for 12 to 13 years total. These guys are frequently cited as one of the greatest backing bands of all time, because every single one of these men is a fantastic musician. When they formed, Pete was already a veteran of the British pub and touring scene, like Elvis. Bruce was a working musician since the mid-60s, and though Steve was fresh out of college, he was classically trained and highly versatile. These guys didn't just play the instruments behind Elvis, they elevated his music, and their cohesion as a group was key to why his albums with them are considered some of the greatest of all time, even though they were not very cohesive as people. The problem is they clashed hard and fell apart, especially Elvis and Bruce. More on that later. But in the early 2000s, Elvis regrouped with Steve and Pete, plus veteran bassist Davey Farragher, who brought his own additional talents as a vocalist and arranger. This group was named The Imposters, and they've been his backing band ever since, for even longer than The Attractions ever were. While I would say the former represents Elvis's golden age, but prepare yourselves for where it very much was not, I would also say that the latter represents a very strong and consistent silver age that's lasted for over 20 years now. I'm gonna have a lot of praise for both bands and their albums, so it's fitting that the first on the list has neither of them. Number 33, Kojak Variety. Perhaps the most contentious period of Costello's career was the 90s and the albums he released while signed to Warner Brothers Records. It's generally agreed to be his weakest output, but I'm actually going to spend a lot of this list standing up for this period. There are some very good records he put out in that decade. They just had to follow up one of the best decades of releases anyone's ever had. This isn't one of them. Kojak Variety is his second covers album after Almost Blue from 1981. The concept was to cover songs from some of his favorite musicians, but lesser-known tracks, which is an idea with a surprising amount of personal weight behind it. Elvis recalls in his book that he'd listened to some of these exact songs as a child because his father, Ross McManus, worked in the British dance band tradition. By law at the time, 50% of all music played on the radio had to be performed live so that working musicians would have a steady job, meaning that radio would play old-school jazz big bands covering current hits live instead of just airing the original recordings. So Ross would bring home advanced singles of the newest hits for him to practice, and then he would later perform those songs on the radio with the Joe Loss Orchestra. If Declan liked the single, Ross let him have it. The album is composed of some of those old favorites of his, plus many songs that he was already covering live since the mid-80s, and random discoveries he'd make as he trawled through record stores and pawn shops over the years. It's a simple idea, but one I respect on paper. The album was delayed several years until 1995, when it was mostly recorded years before with many of the session musicians he was working with at the time, including The Attractions drummer Pete Thomas and session legends dubbed the Rude Five, guitarists Mark Rebo and James Burton, drummer Jim Keltner, bassist Jerry Sheff, and keyboardist Larry Knechtel. These guys worked with Tom Waits, Bob Dylan, several of the Beatles for their solo records, and Elvis Presley. This was Costello's chance to do one more album with them, no stress, rent a recording studio in Barbados, and have a good time. He even titled the album after a variety store near the studio, as if in tribute to the good time atmosphere provided by Barbados. Now, on the surface, this doesn't sound like an album that was ever going to rank high in Costello's career, but there's nothing to suggest it was going to be a disaster, at least in description. So it begs the question, why is Kojak Variety at the bottom of the list? Here's the thing. The trouble with doing a ranking video like this, where I've lined up all of these albums in a numerical order, is that numbers have so heavily colored every form of contemporary criticism. 1 to 5 stars, 5.7 out of 10. We've gotten it in our heads that these mean anything, numbers aggregated together into a nebulous idea of worth, superseding the actual content of a review in the eyes of the viewer, when in truth, these numbers mean completely different things for each critic and publication. I meant to get this video out for Elvis's 70th birthday, but then the script deleted itself, so I delayed it, and I was sad about that, like the number 70 mattered. It's too easy to see a video like this and assume all of these albums are placed in a rigid line of quality, like number 32 will be exactly as much better than 33 as 31 is from 32. When really, we're grading on the weirdest curve where most of the albums I review today are over there in terms of quality. Bit of insider baseball, I do give these albums numerical scores as I review them to roughly order my thoughts. But guess what? Most of these albums share the exact same score with 60% of the others. It's not as useful as you'd think. An album ranking at the very bottom is not as severe as it looks unless the number is all you look at, which is why I don't put those scores in my music reviews. My words need to carry my thoughts, and they'll do that a lot better than a meaningless grade out of 10. Which is why it's with some trepidation that I have to admit to you all that the bottom 2 albums on this list are the only Elvis Costello albums that I think outright suck. Kojak Variety is way worse than it really should be. But its issues are more subtle than you'd think. The problem is not with Elvis. He's actually in great voice throughout the album. If you can say anything firmly positive about the Warner Brothers years, it's that it was arguably his most consistently strong work as a singer. He has a weird singing voice, amalgamated from the greats of soul, jazz, rhythm and blues, country and folk, filtered through a nerdy and snotty Irish Englishman. But during this decade, he had perhaps his best clarity of voice and technical ability, which is impressive because he had laryngitis early in the sessions, but this only really affected his Little Richard cover. Otherwise, he had a hell of a bounce back. And this was the 3rd time this happened since 1980. I tend to also think of the Warner Brothers years as the Kevin Killen years, because almost every album has him involved as co-producer or engineer, though he was involved in a few outside of this period too. Killen, in the right context, does a great job of bringing out an album's clarity, and he'll be all over the middle third of this list. But that clarity is Kojak Variety's fatal flaw, and what makes these performances sink without a trace. It has an anemic, toothless karaoke bar production. There's no muscle, bite, atmosphere, or grandness where there should be. The instrument tones are too clean and pristine. Their character and edge sound shaved off, even when the rock and roll energy and Elvis's roaring vocals call for some dirt. Their version of Little Richard's Bama Lama Bamaloo is borderline embarrassing.
Bama Lama, Bamaloo, Bama Lama, Bamaloo.
It's not the most dignified song to begin with, just a clone of Tutti Frutti that's somehow even dumber. Imagine that, but without grit. You know, almost. There is so little bass on this album, and it needs more body than it has. Elvis sings every track with all of the gusto and spit he can muster, but the instrumentation sonically fails to match him. Or the band only seem to play the song like a practice vamp. Almost every track sounds wrong somehow. There's only one other Costello album that sounds this much like nobody was on the same page, and it's next on the list. Often it sounds like nobody's even playing the same song. I know Mark Ribot is celebrated for his jagged, avant-garde approach. He's a major building block of Tom Waits' sound, but it's like he's allergic to playing on key here. And again, these might not necessarily be problems if the production wasn't so sterile. You defanged Mark Ribot. Of course it sounds like shit. It's a shame Elvis was estranged from the Attractions during most of the recording, according to him due to legal issues and revived bad blood between them, because this album is crying out for Steve Naive and Bruce Thomas. The old session veterans just do not gel with him and enhance him like the Attractions did. And as we talk about the albums the Rude Five worked on, we'll hear that it's a problem unique to Kojak Variety. Usually they're way more into it, but here, they sound like the hired session musicians that they are. Pete Thomas did stick around as one of Elvis's drummers during this period, and the mix at least respects him. He's right up front, and frankly, he's drowning out a lot of the other instruments. All that said, there are 4 covers here that I think work. Bob Dylan's I Threw It All Away and Cilla Black's I've Been Wrong Before are the 2 points where the production and performances actually line up to give the song some justice. The latter as good as Elvis's best work at the time.
The night we met, a night that I won't forget.
Also, Elvis, who is constantly compared to Bob Dylan, has never vocally sounded so much like him. Or Tom Petty, actually.
No matter what you think about it, just won't be able to do without it.
The opener, Screamin' Jay Hawkins is Strange, does fall victim to the flat production, and Elvis doesn't have an ounce of the manic energy of Hawkins. But it's the one time where the Rude Five's energy actually matches his, and they're clearly having fun. The very first thing that happens on the album is Elvis flubbing the opening because he starts laughing.
How many...
And fourth, the closer, The Kinks' Days, which is so psychedelically produced and arranged that it sounds like it's from a different album, in a good way.
Thank you for the days.
That's 4 songs out of 15. Thus, bottom of the list. It's worth mentioning the Rhino Records reissue, which includes a whole second album's worth of outtakes and compilation appearances, many of which are country and are very stripped down compared to the main album. But they have all the same issues as the album. These renditions should be good, especially the livelier tracks like Hoagie Carmichael's My Resistance Is Low, and definitely Graham Parsons' Still Feeling Blue, and Dave Bartholomew's That's How You Got Killed Before. Elvis will prove later in the list just how good he is at covering these 2 artists. But again, there's no body or presence to any instrument that isn't Elvis's voice or the drums. Everything is hidden behind them. They cover T-Bone Burnett here, who produced 2 of the albums before this, and frankly, if they wanted to strip it down, they should have brought him back. This album is begging for a producer that isn't Costello or Killen because their skills just don't translate. The exceptions are the Everly Brothers' Sleepless Nights and the Beatles' You've Gotta Hide Your Love Away, where finally the instruments are as present and audible as the vocals, and go figure, it makes the songs work. I also enjoyed his version of the Irish execution ballad, The Night Before Larry Was Stretched, which Elvis recorded for a compilation of Irish music, and the orchestrated rendition of But Not For Me by the Gershwins, which is a lovely sonic peek ahead to his work with Burt Bacharach. Again, only 4 songs I really liked. But out of 20 this time. Kojak Variety just refuses to be remembered. I don't hate it by any means, but aside from those few bright spots, I don't seek it out by choice. I'm gonna spend so much time gushing over the music higher up this list, so even if this isn't the worst album in the world, it sticks out in Costello's discography for how shockingly unimpressive it is. I'd go so far as to call it skippable. Now, for every album on the list, there's a very loose trifecta of elements that go into my opinions on it, and thereby its ranking on the list. The grand majority of albums have all 3 of these elements working well and synergizing with each other, but when one or more element doesn't work, it's probably on this back quarter of the list. 1, Elvis himself, both his performance and the material he's working with, be it his own songs or collaborations or covers. 2, his backing musicians, whether they're the Attractions, the Imposters, another backing band or collaborators, or session musicians. This is the element that I think is by far the most consistent. Rarely does he work with a musician who doesn't know what they're doing or is holding a song back. And if that does seem to happen, like we just talked about, the more likely culprit is number 3, the production. How the album sounds, whether the recording techniques or studio trickery service the music or not, or at worst, actively distract from it. Thing is, when the production is off on an album, it can be hard to tell if that was a decision by the producer or Elvis himself, as he often co-produces starting in the Warner Brothers period and takes as much creative control as he can. For the first album on the list, if it wasn't obvious, this entire trifecta failed. Same for the second. Number 32, Goodbye Cruel World. This album is known as the worst album by Elvis and the Attractions. And sometimes it's fun to talk about something that's exactly as bad as its reputation. I put the bra back on, deal with it. For the album prior to this, 1983's Punch the Clock, Elvis enlisted producers Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, probably best known at the time for their flood of UK hits with Madness, to help him and the Attractions craft one of their own. Their records sold less and less since their commercial peak at the turn of the decade. While the results were sonically time-stamped to the pop, R&B, and soul of 1983 England, the move worked. It sold well, and it produced at least two of Elvis's best-known songs. We'll talk about it a little later. It didn't come without casualties. The already shaky working relationship of Elvis and the Attractions officially began its tailspin, as they were significantly sidelined compared to previous albums, especially virtuoso Steve Naive, who was pivotal to the construction of 1982's Imperial Bedroom. Elvis went on a solo acoustic tour across America, no Attractions for the first time since he formed them, where he met and befriended T-Bone Burnett, setting the stage for 1986's King of America. We won't talk about either of those until much later. Come 1984, the band all hated each other, especially Elvis and Bruce Thomas. Steve had a breakdown, shaved his head, and briefly went by Maurice Worm. Costello was separated from his first wife, Mary, for almost his entire recording career, and this was around the point where the marriage was officially unsalvageable. He was drinking heavily, and when the time came to record the next album, the material he brought in was very sad, bitter, tangibly self-loathing. After the bright, pop-ready Punch the Clock, it was a big swerve. But there's nothing to say that darkness couldn't work. Except two people very much did. Returning producers, Langer and Winstanley. They wanted to continue that bright, poppy sound, and they recalled balking at these new songs and fighting with Elvis about the direction and sound of the album. The producers seemingly got their way a lot more than he did, as the result is even more sonically time-stamped to the 80s. But unlike Punch the Clock, the band and the producers are no longer in sync and instead crash into each other. Now, if you pay attention to the songs, everything good about Elvis's work is in Goodbye Cruel World. He is noted as one of the very best songwriters of the last several decades. And his talents as a lyricist and crafter of melodies are present and noticeable. He even delivers a strong vocal performance throughout, though you can tell his early penchant for puns and wordplay is starting to strain.
It's tearing me up, it's tearing me down.
The Only Flame in Town opens the album with the classic love as fire metaphor, taken to its extreme. In much the same way as his previous hit, Every Day I Write the Book, used writing as its metaphor. It's songwriting 101, and it works.
But you rule how to go, turn my heart to a cinder, and with each passing day, you less tender and more tender.
But for most of the album, the darkness is front and center. He delves into his failed marriage, his shame in himself and in romance, families being torn apart, and even leaning apocalyptic in his satire. More than any of his albums up to this point, it's seeped in a resigned bitterness. I mean, he titled it Goodbye Cruel World. It was meant sarcastically, but was it really? And again, there's no reason that can't work, especially from such a skilled songwriter. But it sounds like plastic ass. Synths and keyboards, drum machines, horns, and especially intrusive 80s saxophone solos. Every song is absolutely buried in dated production. Punch the Clock is dated too, but it manages to strike a balance with its band, the horns, and the backing singers. There's an economy of sound to that album. They didn't overdo it. This is them overdoing it. I would say half of the added instruments in every song, and especially the keyboards, do not need to be there. They don't contribute to the material or enhance it, only distract from it. Some of Imperial Bedroom's detractors at the time said the same thing about its production, but these two albums are worlds apart. In all of the Baroque, psychedelic pop excess that went into Imperial Bedroom, there was not a single wasted instrument or note, and they played so many notes. Everything in that album needs and deserves to be there. In comparison, Goodbye Cruel World got a kind response from contemporary critics, about on the level of Punch the Clock, but it's so clear in hindsight the creative failing happening here. There's a quote that I think covers it. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. I wouldn't take anything out of Imperial Bedroom. I 100% would for this. There are two other albums that this reminds me of, released at around the same time, Pulling Rabbits Out of a Hat by Sparks, and Brighter Than a Thousand Suns by Killing Joke. Both of these bands were continuing their very of-the-time 80s synth-driven sound, but where their previous albums mostly worked and also managed an economy of sound, these albums were drowning in distracting synths and washed-out production, which harmed what was otherwise good material. Now, Sparks had actually self-produced their last album, In Outer Space, but Killing Joke had the same producer for 1,000 Suns as the last album, Nighttime, Chris Kimsey, which is the same situation as Goodbye Cruel World with Langer and Winstanley. Killing Joke's record label requested that the album be remixed by an outside producer to make it more commercial, which is why it ended up so overproduced. But when the album was reissued in 2008, Chris Kimsey's original mixes were reinstated. The synths, the reverb, the 80s production, it's all still there, but they synergize with the material. That is what makes the problems with Goodbye Cruel World so clear. Keyboards, drum machines, saxophones, duetting with Daryl Hall, none of these things are necessarily bad. The problem is that the album was mixed so that all of this studio trickery distracts from the songs. Langer and Winstanley actively try to cover up Costello's drunken, divorcee ramblings in a desperate attempt to make this album marketable. Every keyboard that isn't the piano sounds like its tone was chosen to be distracting. Everything is too trebly, like in Pulling Rabbits. It's not just an organ, it needs to be a tooting pipe organ.
They took old Danny Boy for a ride from the arms of his bride to bed.
It's not just a bass tremolo keeping time. It needs to be up front in the listener's ear like a throbbing headache.
Meanwhile, there's lights over the ocean burning brighter than the sun.
Compare this with later albums that Costello co-produced, and it's so clear that he would have never chosen half of the sounds here if he'd had more control and been in the right headspace. Sadly, even he admitted in 2015 that he was in two minds making this album, trying to be an artist and trying to maintain the band's chart presence. Within 2 years, he gave up on the latter, and his output is all the better for it. The expanded reissue by Rhino Records includes several solo demos, early prototypes, and live versions, and these make it even clearer how we're hearing the worst versions of these songs. Stripped down to just Elvis and a guitar or piano, the actual content of the lyrics can be absorbed. Also, it's really obvious that The Comedians was never meant to be in 5/4. It has so much more impact in its original bolero style.
The social circle had these cardiac complaints. The hearts are empty and their hands are full. All these newfound fond acquaintances turn out to be the red rag to my bull.
I would add that almost everything he released in this album cycle outside of the album is better than what's on the album. Turning the Town Red from the Scully TV series is as good as anything on Punch the Clock, and was also produced by Langer and Winstanley. There's some great covers of Sam Cooke's Get Yourself Another Fool, Richard and Linda Thompson's Withered and Died. He and his old friend and former producer Nick Lowe do a gorgeous duet cover of Baby It's You by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. Between these and I Want to Be Loved on the album, it's not a great sign when the best music put out by one of rock's greatest songwriters is mostly covers. By the way, don't worry about The Comedians. Elvis rewrote it a few years later and had it completely rescued by no less a talent than Roy fucking Orbison. All of that said, is there anything on this album that I like entirely as is? Yes, the singles, The Only Flame in Town and I Want to Be Loved, while still nauseatingly overproduced, I think succeed at rising above it to the level of charming 80s artifacts like Wang Chung's Everybody Have Fun Tonight or Starship's Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. Home Truth, Room Without a Number, and Joe Porterhouse are almost good enough to escape the production, but still end up smothered. But more than all of those, I love the Deportees Club. One song that's not included on the expanded reissue, because it was actually recorded during the Imperial Bedroom sessions, is Little Goody Two Shoes. It's this ridiculous, over-the-top, Jerry Lee Lewis type rock and roller that I absolutely love. It is ridiculous. That song has an alternate, slower, slinkier, seductive jazz version that is not remotely as compelling, but Elvis rewrote that into this album's Inch by Inch. It too has never left an impact on me. It's a total downgrade. But the Deportees Club makes up for it. It is such a refreshing, goofy, screaming rager of a rocker, and I wouldn't change a thing about it. Elvis didn't agree with me, and he later stripped the song down and reworked it into Deportee during the King of America period, and it's so plodding and sickly. It sounds like one of those overdramatic slow covers that comically misses the point. It doesn't translate like he thinks it does. I'll always love the original. No irony, it's beautiful. The reason Elvis's famously worst album just misses the bottom of my list is because when I listen to it, I can dig out the good songs in there, in almost every track. They're struggling for air, but they're in there. Whereas when I listen to Kojak Variety, I know it came out how he wanted, and it's still crap. Thankfully, those are the only two albums on this list that I would call bad. Everything else after this point is not. But that doesn't mean they won't have significant flaws. On that note, back to the Warner Brothers years. I want to quickly discuss something that will come up again because it's inextricably linked to Elvis's music and career. Anger. From his first album and for much of his career, he was pegged as an angry songwriter. His music seemed to come from a jaded and frustrated young man's point of view, and he sang it like it. Elvis insists that a lot of that perception was due to his vocal style and his standoffish persona he put on for interviews. It's believed that this persona was encouraged and even a kind of punk rock marketing ploy by his then manager, Jake Riviera, a very standoffish person himself. At least one person who knew them in the 80s said that Elvis himself was actually quite nice. Quoting Joe Marshall at the time, "That piss on you attitude is all Jake." Though his old Flip City bandmate said that he could be rude to an inattentive audience all the way back in the mid-70s. In his memoir, Elvis says it only came from being shy and frequently drunk, and he laid off the bullshit after he faced real consequences for it. To his credit, Elvis takes full responsibility for his actions and never blames anyone else for them. Get ready for that iceberg.
I'll be in an interview now with a sort of like French journalist or something, and he's read Wikipedia, so he kind of goes, "So you are all about you are all about revenge and guilt." I go, "This is something I said for effect when I was 22. Are you seriously quoting that to me?"
If you pay attention to his records from day one, there are plenty more emotions and viewpoints on display, but I'd say there's still a strong sense that they come from the same place as a modern, angry, young, nerdy, cis-hetero boy, sneering and above it all. Elvis at least seems to know that he's playing the bad guy. He's a storyteller playing a character, and it's a reflection of how he saw the world and people around him. It's not until around the mid-90s, when he had effectively evolved into his destined final form of musical Renaissance man, that his music didn't sound so angry anymore. From then on, even the darkest and meanest of his songs could feel like they were about characters and stories, not personal targets. However, he admits that one of his albums was very angry. And it doesn't feel like it. If anything, it should have been angrier than it was, and better targeted. Number 31, Mighty Like a Rose. I don't have the CD or vinyl for this one. Recorded in 1990, Elvis says the album was inspired by the Gulf War, or at least his anger when recording it was fueled by the war. Knowing this makes the album worse. Mighty Like a Rose is in many ways the more focused sequel to 1989's Spike, which was Elvis indulging in every idea he had with every session musician he wanted. Most of this album was recorded with a condensed band formed from those musicians, including Mark Ribot, Jim Keltner, Larry Knechtel. It's the Rude Five from Kojak Variety. And if that album taught me anything, it's that this one is not going to live on the strength of these musicians, seasoned vets that they are, but on their cohesion with Costello and the production around them. Thankfully, these are not quite the problems they are in Kojak. At least not the former. Where Spike was co-produced by T-Bone Burnett, Mitchell Froom takes his seat here. Mitchell played on both King of America and Spike, and he's a longtime producer and session musician himself. In fact, he's the original producer and session keyboardist for Crowded House, and eventually their official keyboardist, so he's legit. I also think he never quite got Elvis as a producer. We'll talk plenty about the many producers in Elvis's catalog, and for both of Froom's turns in the seat, there was always something off about the way those albums sound. We'll come back to that. This album does start off with one of its best tracks, though. The Other Side of Summer is a darkly ironic send-up of the Beach Boys, drawing on capitalism's decay of the environment, artistry, and celebrity. There's one couplet at the end of the final verse that aged like fine wine for us millennials.
Now you can't afford to fake all the tricks your parents used to take, because you've been mistakes, you better be wide awake.
I think he meant the environment, but it also fits with the baby boomers being the last generation to have a better life than their parents. Though the song's production is so slick and sterile that it doesn't sound like the 60s or 70s Beach Boys that Elvis aimed for, but more like he's still stuck in the 80s. They employed a wall of sound approach to the mix. There's apparently 2 bass tracks and 14 keyboard tracks on this, but it doesn't sound as alive as they probably wanted. This is going to be a recurring issue with Froome's production. There's also a distinct air of sarcasm poisoning, which we'll get to in a bit, but otherwise it's a solid opener. Hurry Down Doomsday, The Bugs Are Taking Over, is built around cool and chaotic drum loops. Drummer Jim Keltner is credited as co-writer for assembling them. The rest of the song is actually pretty spare, especially compared to the first track. It's otherwise limited to Elvis's hollering over chugging and chiming clean guitars, plus a ripping and erratic guitar solo from TCB veteran James Burton. The lyrics are less specific with its attacks, more picking out a few individuals out of a whole world gone mad, one of whom we'll talk about later, and the general state of culture and entertainment and saying, fuck it, it's over, bring on the locusts. Most of what he picked doesn't match the severity of that idea. The first verse is about a trashy book author, the second's about a wife who's an obsessed fan of a dead country singer. The third is the closest, with one of the album's sharpest bites.
Any day now, a giant insect mutation will swoop down and devour the white man's burden.
Elvis describes the song in the reissue liner notes as written for the days when the mortal sins of the advertising world and the venal sins of the trash culture become unbearable. When the news fixates morbidly on the sentimental appeals of the parents of a missing child, only for it to be revealed that they are the ones who committed the crime. I think the actual song needed more of that, Elvis. That sense of misplaced priorities doesn't end here. The next track, How to Be Dumb, is perhaps Elvis's most direct, most outwardly hateful and spiteful attack on a person. He at least went after Margaret Thatcher in the context of empathy for the Tories' victims. This is just vomit and venom. If there's one unquestionably angry song on the record, it's this one. Ain't about the fucking Gulf War, though. Put a pin in that, not talking about it yet. Musically, it's the first sign of real cracks in the foundation, though. The production and structure are sloppy. The instruments don't blend. The wrong ones stick out of the mix, like Larry Knechtel's overly trebly piano, or the saxophone just dropped on top of the chorus. It's a fun song if you're in the right headspace and don't think about it at all. And he does get in a good shot or two.
You could have walked out anytime you wanted, but face it, you didn't have the courage.
But so soon after that solid introduction, it already feels like we've lost the plot.
Don't you know how to be done? Like a building thrown up oven out in one of those reverse earthquakes.
What the fuck are you talking about? All Grown Up doesn't fix that perception. It's a better song structurally and sonically, beautifully orchestrated, predicting Elvis's work with the Brodsky Quartet or Burt Bacharach, though his voice doesn't sound up to the task just yet. It's reedy and nasally, and Elvis admits that he intentionally sang every song in this period with a violent and guttural attack, whether it served the song or not. But the main issue is the subject. Elvis wrote it about, quote, a practitioner of a jaded posture that I believed I had left behind in the late 80s. And that coupled with a good half of the lyrics, it sounds like it's about the same guy as the last song.
If all of this life has been such a big disappointment to you, why don't you stop blaming some guy and go give the next one a try?
But I don't think it is per se. The character in the song is a girl, but it is at least oddly judgy of young people in a peculiar and unflattering way.
But look at yourself, you'll see you're still so young. You haven't heard the weariness that sounds so jaded on your tongue.
We'll will come back to this later too. It ties into my broader problem with the album, but if the last couple tracks were signs that his priorities were askew, this is a sign that he completely lost touch with the real world. And he actually might have. Elvis acknowledges in the reissue liner notes that he drank a lot at the time, and that affected his behavior. Not his appearance, apparently. He grew out his hair and beard during the winter and just stayed scraggly because it pissed people off. I think he would have done that if he wasn't drinking. Thing is, he was on various substances for most of the 80s into the early 90s. But aside from Goodbye Cruel World, he managed to not let it harm his music. If this album and its many questionable decisions so far are any indication, that was because he had the attractions and/or producer Nick Lowe to keep him steady. Without any of them, with only Guns for Hire backing him up, and with Elvis having more creative control since he signed with Warner Brothers, we're left with him unfiltered at a low point in his life. Wait for it. We at least get back on track with the next 3 songs, a mini-suite about the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Elvis does clarify in the reissue that he already wrote the album when the Gulf War broke out, so though it fueled his anger, none of the songs were directly about it. This does not help it, to be clear. But the Berlin Wall and the Cold War do give the album connective tissue to the Gulf War. The war is directly connected to American and Soviet occupation of the Middle East, and once allies becoming convenient scapegoats. Republicans love that story. Invasion Hit Parade follows a revolutionary as he sees his newly liberated country, Elvis puts quotes around liberated in the liner notes, swamped with capitalism's trash culture.
Been mopping up all the stubborn ones who just refuse to be saved.
It notably features Elvis's father, Ross McManus, on the tasteful and dignified trumpet line. I like this song, though again, the production seems to sap some of the energy out of the chorus. It sounds hollow to me. It points forward to the issues with Kojak varieties. Some of the body is missing from the mix. I think Elvis made a way better version of this song many years later. Harpy's Bazaar follows a young, average woman uncorrupted by riches, as a wealthy playboy falls for her for that exact reason. The music is stately and elegant, with Larry Knechtel on harpsichord, Mitchell Froom on organ, and a woodwind section, giving the song a palatial setting that recalls 1982's Imperial Bedroom. It's nowhere as well produced, though. Again, there's a sterility to this album's sound that holds it back, even its good songs.
You're so hard to tell the truth to, so easy to corrupt.
But the third track in this suite is a huge bright spot. After the Fall is a stark, haunting acoustic folk tune where the production pulls back and just lets the resonance of the instruments carry its atmosphere. It's some of Mark Ribot's best work on a Costello record, his Spanish guitar fluttering alongside Elvis's hushed, almost villainous vocals. The song is a direct sequel to Harpy's Bazaar, where the unassuming young woman is now the wealthy, worldly man's dominatrix. But however consensual it may be, it doesn't sound safe nor sane, as both were long hollowed out by their experiences.
She seems brittle and small, it don't sound like her at all. Since she came back to him after the fall.
After that, the rest is just an okay pop album. Yeah, we're done with, relevant commentary or worldly observations. Judging from the liner notes, Elvis divided the album like that intentionally. This was the last he imagined as a two-sided vinyl, so each side is distinct from each other. And because of that, frankly, the album picks up a bit. Georgie and Her Rival is a cheerful track about, quote, long-distance seduction, disguise, and deception, where the titular two characters have an oddly spiteful long-distance relationship, and Georgie's worst behaviors and habits come out over the phone to him and even her own mother. Elvis properly flexes his melodic skills here. It's some of the best hooks on the album. It doesn't fix the record's sonic issues, but it manages to work with them.
Well, heaven knows what fills the heart and makes you feel so alive. It's impossible to tell apart Georgie and Rival.
The next track and the album's second single is the first of two here, co-written with Paul McCartney in the late 80s. I'll go into more detail on their short songwriting collaboration when we get to Spike, because it was right before that album, but it produced a handful of tracks that each of the guys picked at over the next decade. So Like Candy doesn't hide Paul's influence. It opens with a direct homage to the opening chord of A Hard Day's Night.
Here lies the powder and perfume
before Elvis sings a very McCartney vocal melody. It's a quietly heartbreaking track with its somber, shuffling music. The narrator fondly details all of the parts of his and his lover's bedroom that remind him of her unique characteristics, including a photo of them together. Then he and the song explode in grief. She left him without even saying goodbye, only leaving a cruel little note on a scratched record. It's one of the album's better songs, though Elvis's self-admitted over-singing does undermine some of its emotional weight.
I remember the day that picture was taken. We were so happy, babe, but that's all I can do.
I get the feeling his drinking also affected his singing. He's always had a bit of a snotty slur to his voice, but it feels distinctly lubricated this time around. I guess it works here if you think of his singing as ugly crying. Sure, I'll allow it this time. We have a brief interlude, Couldn't Call It Unexpected number 2, with the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, lending the album a quick shot of New Orleans marching band flair. Couldn't Call It Unexpected was a series of pieces Elvis wrote around this time, some of which were part of his score for the series GBH. Here, number 2 just serves as the playful intro to the next track, which fades in from underneath. That one tries to be playful, but, to be fair and clear, this is kind of an intentional goof. It's the second track co-written with McCartney, and you can tell from the original demo that they planned it as one of Paul's early rock and roll send-ups, which are already a little silly. Graham Thompson went further and suspected that they didn't write it for longer than a lunch break, but Elvis decided he didn't want it to be a cliche, so when he recorded it for this album, he amped it up by putting on a voice like 50s novelty records. He thinks it keeps this section of ballads from dragging, and yeah, it's not boring. But he also acknowledges that you know how to skip it if you don't like it. The fact he hasn't played it live since '91 kind of gives the game away, though. I think even he knows this is just annoying. Okay, I do like the chorus, because Elvis drops the obnoxious voice and just hollers in his own, and it kind of rocks.
She's gonna make you suffer tonight. Do you from the playboy that you made? And when you're worthy of a dance tonight, do you from the playboy that you made?
When he starts shrieking as the song goes on, he does undermine it. The song is trying to be goofy, but it's somehow still only funny on accident. Like he really thought he was doing something here and not just making an ass of himself. I only listen to this song to be astonished by it because I sure don't enjoy it. Luckily, the album has a pretty strong final 3 tracks. Sweet Pear is an achingly tender love ballad, inspired by Jimi Hendrix's ballads, believe it or not. Elvis doesn't play much standout guitar on the album, but he plugs in and plays a humble riff in one of his few solos. And the Dirty Dozen Brass Band help him take the chorus right into the stratosphere.
And bless whatever's in the sky above for bringing it to me.
Elvis does stretch the limits of his vocal range, and it doesn't quite work. He got much better at singing in a high register shortly after, though, and by the end of the 90s, he could belt to the rafters in his sleep. The penultimate track is hands down the most striking on the album, in a good way. Written solely by his wife, Cotto Reardon, it's a dark, soul-bearing plead for love over a soundscape of drones like hanging over a yawning abyss. Lyrically, it's a simple premise. No matter the sadness, struggles, and pain that life throws out, she can weather them and put a happy spin on them. Except for one.
But if you leave me, then I am broken.
It's up there with After the Fall and Approach, and how they're almost the antithesis to the rest of the album, which can border on desperate when it's not excessive. These two are so restrained, yet soul-shattering. And the album closes with another of its best tracks, though we're back to oddball experimentation. The fourth couldn't call it unexpected. It's like a village folk parade based around several thin and small keyboards. It's a clattering racket at first, but the strong melodies bring everything together. It ends a cynical and pessimistic album on its one ray of hope in a world with an uncertain future and lives with uncertain ends.
So told her bell, oh,
Mighty Like a Rose is a messy, maybe misguided pop record with some dated, sterile production. But there's plenty of good songs here, 2 to 4 of them among his best. Despite its low points, it's hardly as bad as his worst albums. And yet, there's some X factor that makes this album so much less than the sum of its parts. In some ways, it's a little more focused than its predecessor, which flopped wildly between slick pop rock, jazz, and folk. Mighty Like a Rose feels on the surface like it should be even better. And yet, I'll have plenty to say about Spike when we get to it, because it's a weird album for Costello, but you can't say it doesn't have personality. It covers a lot of ground in its runtime, for better or worse, but there's an enthusiasm, liveliness, and sincerity that's palpable. I think he had a blast making the record he wanted to make without limits. Mighty Like a Rose doesn't feel enthusiastic or lively, however much he tried, and it's definitely not sincere. He claims the album is angry, and that anger was fueled by the Gulf War, and how real death suddenly became this morbid primetime event on television, but it stops feeling angry past the first few songs, and just sounds like a Costello pop record that's smugly self-satisfied. His strengths as a pop tunesmith don't elevate these songs to the level of any of his previous good pop records, not even the blandest songs on those, and certainly not to his ostensibly angriest songs up until now. To be honest, the only thing that really seems to rile him up is something else entirely. The first verse and chorus of Hurry Down Doomsday refer to a trashy book author, and the entirety of How to Be Dumb is a hate-fueled takedown, or as Elvis puts it in the reissue liner notes, an instruction pamphlet for the innocent, the indiscreet, the snide, and the deluded who confuse freedom of speech with necessity and license. He is preciously coy about whether these songs have any specific targets, but it's widely believed that at least one of them is a particular book, The Big Wheel by Bruce Thomas, the bassist of The Attractions. Elvis butted heads with Bruce the most, and following their breakup, he's the one attraction Elvis will never work with again. There's a reason The Imposters are just The Attractions with a different bassist. The Big Wheel was a novel inspired by Bruce's time touring with the band in the 70s and 80s, but with all the participants only named through synecdoche. Who was obvious anyway, and it was not flattering. Hurry Down Doomsday and How to Be Dumb are the only songs that sound and read really angry. They're the only times where Elvis clearly bites back against something. On the album, all his anger only really comes out over a petty beef. His usual famous talent for wit, lyricism, and wordplay, and even his bitterest, meanest songs, is reduced to sophomoric insults. I've joked a lot about Playboy to a Man, but no, How to Be Dumb is the worst song he ever wrote. It's like if instead of writing Pump It Up, he wrote Boom Boom Pow. That's the drop in wit that we're looking at here.
I'm sold 3008, you sold 2000 and late.
And this is a context where that anger could have and should have served a more meaningful purpose. On just the last album, he had a song directly opposing the death penalty, centered around a very specific real-life British case. A song about a flicker of humanity during the Troubles, and a song where he tells Margaret Thatcher that he hopes he lives long enough to see her die. There is nothing here with the intensity and genuine righteous anger of Tramp the Dirt Down. Instead, this is the shit he cares about only 2 years later. If the rest of the album wasn't mostly solid, that would have put it at the bottom of the list. Combine this with how smug he sings the whole first half of the album in these songs of the fakeness of celebrity, oncoming apocalypse, cynicism, and bitter score settling, and then top it off with the desperate flailing of Playboy to a Man, and there's just some fuckboy energy coming off this album. I don't get that from anything else he's released, not even his early records where he's playing a fuckboy. And if you want to make the case that it is independent of Bruce, I would direct you to every time the book comes up in his liner notes or memoir or contemporary interviews that directly address the song, and he tries to be inconspicuous with it, but you know you're reading some jealous bitch horseshit. And sure, there is a stronger case that Bruce's book was hurtful and like a stab in the back after years of working together, and that whether he was drinking at the time or not, Elvis had every right to be angry and to bite back. But I remind you, the Gulf War and the last album, they're both children, go sit in the corner. Elvis's Pulse interview with Michael Azerrad that year is something else. Azerrad puffs him and the album up and is 100% on his side about Bruce. They both shit on Bruce's writing abilities, but Elvis is such a little bitch. He's 37 and calls himself an old man and acts like he's figured it all out, and bro, I actually relate a lot to that. I'm in my 30s now, but I felt so old, jaded, and miserable when I was in my teens and 20s, because I was dysphoric and depressed, that I felt like I was in my 50s. But now I feel way younger than I am, thanks to getting out of the closet and getting on the right hormones. Elvis seemed much more level-headed and relaxed a few years later in another Pulse interview, right after inadvertently reuniting with the Attractions. That album has a song partially inspired by alcoholism, so I expect that was around when he worked through the habit. I imagine a happier, less drunk Elvis would have probably focused his anger better than on Mighty Like a Rose. Minorest of side notes, an album does not have to sound like a particular point in time, nor fresh beyond its release date. You can release an album so specifically sonically 1991, and it can still sound great decades later. You can also buck all current trends and do what you want, and your album might still hold up long after those trends are stale. But 1991 was such a watershed for music, alternative music especially, which Elvis roughly fits under. Also the year I was born, so I'm quite attached to it. Some of his last album is pretty dated to 1989 in its production, but that's more forgivable in the scope of popular music's evolution. The late 80s was the dry well before 91 broke the dam. It was also loaded with great songs, so it largely rises above it. We'll get to it. Mighty Like a Rose is not, and combine that with its outdated, sterile production and cluelessness about life outside of Elvis's bubble, that only makes it even more irrelevant. It's notable that Elvis was a constant fixture in the top albums of the year for multiple UK music publications, right up until 91, and then they ignored him for almost the entire 90s. One of the books that I'll refer to throughout this video is God's Comic by David Goldstone, named after a track on Spike and released just before this album. In fact, he originally wrote it just before Spike. Its first title was A Man Out of Time, after the Imperial Bedroom track, before he expanded it after Spike's release and renamed it, because that song's title was kind of his thesis on Elvis as a musician. He didn't follow trends, he followed his own whims and inspirations as he saw fit, whether they were old hat or not. He's a man out of time. Generally, I agree, and I kind of see that as the timeless appeal of his music. But while this album is hardly his worst, it's not even a bad album. It is the one where Elvis no longer feels like a man out of time, but a man out of touch. The first sign that happens, when the next generations can happily drop your ass, is when you forget what it's like to be young. Again, the Warner Brothers years are so much better than their reputation. Just not these albums. While we're on the subject of not bad but significantly flawed, Jimmy Fallon. Elvis was invited to be a musical guest on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon while promoting his interview show, Spectacle. Fallon somehow convinced alternative hip-hop heroes, The Roots, to be his in-house band. They still are to this day, so he must be doing something right. Roots drummer and bandleader Questlove is at minimum as big a Costello fan as I am, and on their first show performing together, the band convinced Elvis to do some different versions of two of his old songs. This proved to be just step one on the way to them doing a whole album together, taking samples and lyrics from Elvis's catalog and creating something new and fresh out of them. I just wish Elvis turned up for it as much as the Roots did. Number 30. Wise Up Ghost with The Roots. This album was pretty well received when it came out. I remember liking it at the time, if not anywhere as much as Elvis's last album, but after a full listen or two, I never went back to it, not until writing for this video a good decade later. And in all that time, I realized I didn't remember anything past the first 3 tracks. That's for a pretty obvious reason in hindsight. Wise Up Ghost, if anything, makes a great first impression. We open with Walk Us Uptown, a strutting hip-hop jam that bites back at power taken through violence and lies. They give away how relaxed the recording process really was right at the beginning, when you hear someone turn down the volume on an Apple computer. Questlove almost owns the whole beat with his tight, crisp drumming, but there's so much going on around him and Elvis, the sharp, rock-steady horns and keyboards, and nothing gets drowned out. Elvis brings the swagger, but his vocals are a little too loose and relaxed. He sounds like he needs to clear his throat, but the music around him makes up for it.
Down that flag and dishonor that vow, 'cause we must not change its color now.
Sugar Won't Work has such a smooth, infectious groove that's almost perfectly suited to Elvis's old-school, Sinatra-esque attitude to music. The Brent Fisher Orchestra takes it to an angelic next level in the choruses, and even Elvis's dissonant harmonies can't ruin it.
Me and my stupid heart, we will never part. But my sugar won't work.
But my favorite song on the album is Refuse to Be Saved, that reworking of Invasion Hit Parade I mentioned earlier. Instead of slightly awkward art pop, it's an even punchier, effortlessly cool hip-hop banger. Elvis recites the lyrics with this amused sneer, while the band just blows it up behind him. The song's themes of liberation buried in asterisks ages like wine when put in the hands of people of color.
I can tell the time by the color of my skin, and I know my neighbor, 'cause he's the one, yes, he's the one who always turns me in.
It's a killer 1-2-3 opening salvo. The whole album was almost entirely written and co-produced by Questlove, Elvis, and Stephen Mandel. And if Wise Up Ghost has anything, it's focus and cohesion. And after this point, it loses me. The next track, Wake Me Up, is hands down the most successful song from this record, just in terms of streaming numbers. And it should work. Tight beats, snappy horns, a killer jagged guitar bridge. The problem is Elvis's vocals. He sings in a low, almost mumbling drawl that does not flatter these lyrics, most of which are recycled from Bedlam from The Delivery Man and the title track from The River in Reverse. Two songs and albums I love, but where the previous three tracks could rise above his iffy vocals, his performance here sucks the life right out of it. Whatever swagger he tries to put into it does not land.
I got this scared, decorated ghost strapped to the steel trunk of a Mustang. They move it down a Cypress Grove, where traders hang and stars still spangle.
The band built the music for Tripwire on top of a sample from Satellite from Spike, and when you put wheezy, off-key old Elvis on top of a song where younger Elvis sang great, it's just a bad idea.
Tripwire, 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 tripwire.
And Elvis brings down Viceroy's Row and the title track near the end. The former tries to be a blissed-out R&B song about wealth and power under a dictatorship, but Elvis just isn't up for it.
Watching the pipeline as it overflows. Sitting pretty here on Viceroy's Road.
And the title track doesn't have the most interesting lyrics, but the Roots elevate a sample of the orchestral intro from the North track, Can You Be True, a song nowhere as dramatic as its intro, and make it even more intense for a fantastic and impressive 6 minutes. But Elvis does this.
Rise up, when you gonna rise up? Rise up, ghost. Feel some size up. Wise up, ghost.
His singing is a core issue of the album. It's some of his worst, most dull, off-key vocals, though his very worst performance has the opposite problem somehow. Get ready for that. I get what he's going for, something more understated and atmospheric, rather than upfront and in your face, but it just doesn't work with his voice and what he usually does well as a singer. He's sometimes accused of being a bad singer, but I feel how Grail Marcus feels, just a bit kinder. He's actually a great singer, cursed with an ugly voice. If you're willing to sit with him and get used to him, you'll catch on to his talents and charm as a vocalist. But this is the only album I can think of where he sings this flatly and off-key so much that it brings everything down around him. There's only one other album where his vocals are a serious issue, and he doesn't harm that one anywhere as much as he harms this. Many of the beats are at a slower tempo too, and when Elvis doesn't put his all into it for most of the album, the good slow tracks, like She Might Be a Grenade, still feel boring in that context. And it highlights how these lyrics were clearly not written for these beats. The risk of recycling lyrics like this is it invites comparison to the original songs, and it's rare that I prefer the rework. On one hand, Refuse to Be Saved works great because there's no self-seriousness to it. I like it more than Invasion Hit Parade. On the other hand, Wake Me Up and Stick Out Your Tongue, which reworks Pills and Soap from Punch the Clock, don't work for me because they're overly self-serious, coming across like bored, plodding rambles. They're way worse versions. The Roots' beats and instrumentation are consistently great, Elvis just doesn't match them. To be fair to him, there are probably reasons for his performance. His previous album didn't sell great, and his band The Sugarcanes broke up the day it released. The subsequent tour revisited his old spinning songbook show format, essentially exploring all corners of his output, and he figured he should just focus on being a performing musician, a touring song and dance man. That was still his attitude in his 2015 memoir, all the way to 2017. Significantly, in November 2011, his father Ross passed away, and Elvis was no longer motivated to release new albums now that his dad wasn't around to hear them. Considering the quality of the music he put out before and after this, I think Wise Up Ghost suffered from that context and would have been better recorded earlier or later. There are still highlights, though. Come the Meantimes kicks things back into gear halfway through the album. Lyrically, it's a bleak corruption of Jesus' resurrection, where salvation amounts to nothing when people lose their lives to drugs and alcohol. The song's urgency and insistence make up for a lot on Elvis's part.
I used to be baby, you used to be praying to me from the meantime.
I mentioned She Might Be a Grenade, a rework of the Delivery Man bonus track She's Pulling Out the Pin. In its own context, divorced from the sleepy tracks around it, it's a great example of this band's control of dynamics, starting with just Questlove's bare, simple drum beat and Elvis's Wurlitzer, and then more instruments swell and build behind them throughout the track.
She's tearing at the seams, she's going to extremes. Nobody told her it was a sin, so she's pulling out the pin.
Cinco Minutos con Vos is a direct response to Elvis's song Shipbuilding, which he wrote in protest of the Falklands War, but from an English perspective. This song flips it to an Argentinian perspective and the people they lost. The music is dark and ominous, like seeing a battleship approach from the shoreline. Elvis's vocals are still weak, wheezy, and off-key, but guest vocalist La Marisol makes up for him like he isn't even there. Gorgeous.
Mi padre sabía, me lo susurró, vete a Montevideo y espérame ahí.
There is an interesting detail in the credits. The vocal engineer is a one Sebastian Chris, who's a very big producer and engineer in Latin pop, but most relevantly for our purposes, he's Costello's go-to producer starting 5 years later. He's co-produced pretty much everything he's done since. And not to spoil the second half of the list, but that's for a damn good reason. The album closer, If I Could Believe, a piano ballad written solely by Elvis, is once again not his strongest or cleverest set of lyrics, but for once, he manages to bring out his usual intense passion in his singing. It's his best vocal performance after the first 3 tracks, and the only other time when Elvis of Eld and Future actually shines through on the record.
If I could believe you were from heaven sent, then just losing you would be my punishment.
The deluxe edition's bonus tracks are much the same as the rest of the album, killer beats that Elvis doesn't quite match, but The Puppet Has Cut His Strings is a noteworthy exception. Questlove sent him a gloomy, piano-based instrumental, and off the cuff, sitting at his kitchen counter, he wrote and sang a song into his laptop about his father's final days. That haunting quality, the obvious lower quality mic, and Elvis's distant, airy vocals actually make this song work great. It feels like you're drifting in limbo between life and the afterlife. Elvis even intended to re-record his vocals, and Questlove told him, that's it. That's the take. It's not a jam like Refuse to Be Saved, but it is striking and unsettling.
Canopy set and trim, slowly closing. The puppet has cut his strings.
I want to like Wise Up Ghost a lot more than I do, but it's not the equal collaboration it was supposed to be. It's more a great band carrying Elvis, who was just out of gas at the time. The album cover identifies the album as number 1, implying that they could do a second record down the line. And I would like to hear something new from this collaboration, especially since Elvis did get his creative spark back in a big way. That guy in the Roots could make a front-to-back banger. Next, we rewind to just 2 albums before Wise Up Ghost. In the spring of 2008, while his newest album, Momofuku, awaited release, Elvis entered a Nashville studio with T-Bone Burnett and a handful of country and bluegrass heavyweights, soon to be named the Sugarcanes. In just 3 days, they recorded a stripped-down acoustic album heavily centered around bluegrass and country folk, which was released the next year to a mostly positive response. Mostly positive is much how I feel. Number 29. Secret, Profane, and Sugarcane. If this album does anything right, it's the sound and clarity of the instruments. T-Bone Burnett is a celebrated country producer with a few collaborations with Elvis that will rank much higher on the list. His production style is no frills, capture the instruments as they are, and the result is they sound as good as possible. Jerry Douglas's dobro sings in this setting. You feel like you're right in the middle of the studio, hearing the band play around you. Because there are no drums, the album has a relaxed, cozy feel, even when they rock a little or get rowdy. It's like a bunch of musician friends hanging out and playing at a bar.
And several drunk musicians ran amok.
The album's peaks for me are its very beginning, middle, and end. It opens with Down Among the Wines and Spirits, built around the classic country setup of a broken-hearted man drowning his sorrows. There's a phrase I like to use to describe the previous album that also applies to this song. Breezy effortlessness. Costello and the band hit a comfortable stroll, and he sings the fluttering poetics of the lyrics with this cool confidence. It's a great opener.
Bubbles escaping from him from the rim of a glass of grape. She sails through his memory just like a ship of shapeless.
The album closes on a cover of the 50s pop hit, Changing Partners. Elvis says he knows it from Bing Crosby's version. I prefer Patti Page's. Though honestly, this cover here might beat them all. It's a simple but almost tragic love song about falling instantly for someone and having them slip away just as quickly. Feminist media analysts could probably have a field day with it. That setup could go so wrong so many ways, but I think the song gets away with it by so clearly being for hopeless romantics. The song works at all because it's focused on the shock of this sudden attraction. I read it as tragic because there's no closure. The singer's heart is stolen out of nowhere, and the song ends with them longing and devastated. And consequently, this is the secret weapon that Elvis brings to his version. The bluegrass take on the music is very pretty, and this is a super nerdy criticism, but I actually prefer the cover's key to the original. It feels like it makes the lyrics and melody more impactful, so all of that certainly helps. But this cover is so powerful to me because Elvis's voice is so audibly aged. It makes that lack of closure so much more tragic and heartbreaking because now you can imagine an older man singing about a fleeting crush that he never reconnected with and never got over. A lifetime of wondering what if over something so small and sudden. That's how disrupting that moment and that person were.
Now my arms feel so empty as I gaze around the floor, and I'll keep on changing partners till I hold you once more.
I'm not gonna lie, this version makes me cry. Feels like an album that received such a compliment from me should be a lot higher on the list, doesn't it? Well, let's get to that middle track. The very middle of the album is I Dreamed of My Old Lover. Like Changing Partners, this song is so emotionally powerful to me because of that hopeless longing for something long gone. The narrator dreaming of her old lover is a married woman, and she does not tell her husband or anyone else. She enjoys the dream of her past love entirely in secret, and it's pretty clear to me that she latched onto it at all because it brought a spark to her life that she does not have in her current situation, and she wonders how things would be different if that old relationship never ended. Even more tragic somehow, I get the feeling she never thought about that lack of spark in her life until she had that dream. Like Changing Partners, that disquieting suddenness. Very hopeless romantic and very emotionally powerful.
I wonder how it feels within. I rarely dream of anyone.
But this is where we hit my problems with the album. Despite my praise for T-Bone's production, there's one nagging issue that does more harm to the whole album than you'd expect. A big part of this band's setup is the vocal harmonies of Jim Lauderdale, who Elvis directly talked up in interviews and his memoir. So it's really frustrating that it consistently sounds off. The harmony vocal is panned far off center in the mix, away from Elvis's vocals, and because the mix is quite dry, it means their voices don't blend. The harmony never fully comes together, and their vocals end up clashing with each other instead, which does dull the impact of a song like this. This isn't a totally fair comparison because this example is very produced, but Elvis co-wrote a song with Amy Mann for her band Till Tuesday, The Other End of the Telescope. It will come up again later. He sings harmony vocals on it, and he's panned far off center from Amy as well. But the reverb in the mix allows their vocals to blend. Listen to just the vocals here.
At the other end, at the other end of the telescope.
Now compare that to some of this album's harmonies.
You're my all-time doll. I'm out of control. It's broken my mind. It's not all that you stole. She handed me a mirror that she had gazed upon. It's not very far from sulfur to sugar cane. I'm cutting up a pure white dress that I dyed red, that I dyed red.
Do you hear what I mean? Something's going wrong with the mix on these vocals. There's some mismatch with either the wide pan on Jim's vocals, the sound of everyone's voice, or just Elvis's inherently rough, unsteady singing style. They had 3 days. He probably wasn't very practiced. Either way, that does a surprising lot to hold back the momentum of the album, especially since Jim's such a core part of the structure of its music. Emmylou Harris, country legend Emmylou Harris, former guest vocalist on The Delivery Man who harmonized great with Elvis, Emmylou Harris, does not blend in her harmony vocals on The Crooked Line. Something's not working here.
How I hope I'll find you waiting at the very end of this crooked line.
But that's not the main reason the album is so low on the list. It's worth noting that much of the material here is new recordings of old songs, in multiple ways like the Changing Partners cover. I Dreamed of My Old Lover was an outtake from The Delivery Man, his last country album. 4 of the songs come from his commissioned opera from the mid-2000s, The Secret Songs. It's where The Secret in the title comes from. Hidden Shame was one of 2 songs he wrote for Johnny Cash, and the only one of the 2 Johnny recorded. The other was Complicated Shadows, which Elvis previously recorded with The Attractions on All This Useless Beauty, and he redid it here with the Sugar Canes. I think the only time he re-recorded an album track for another album. Apparently this stripped-down country version was his original idea for it. So considering this is kind of a hodgepodge of material when you look at it on paper, one issue this album does not have is cohesion. These tracks all translate well to country folk, if they weren't written for it originally like the Johnny Cash songs. Red Cotton was written for the opera, but its theme of the horror of antebellum slavery resonates strongly in this setting, even boldly. The problem is how meandering and bland these songs get in the second half. The first half is the best. From between Wine and Spirits and Dreamed of My Old Lover, the 2 songs he wrote for Johnny Cash have good energy and outlaw bite to them.
They never got me for the thing I really did.
Though I prefer the earlier version of Complicated Shadows, it's much more dynamic and less obvious in a rock setting. You wouldn't have guessed it was written for Johnny. My All-Time Doll was the advanced track before release and was another good first impression. It's stomping and big in its heartbreak, and the accordion has a major presence, and we all know I like accordion.
My eyes were blinded by tears, but it's all my own fault. My lips taste the cool words, my eyes sting with salt.
I Felt the Chill Before the Winter Came, co-written with the late great Loretta Lynn, is more in the vein of I Dreamed of My Old Lover. Sad and longing. It's beautifully somber. The album's at its best when it caters to heartbreak and hopeless romanticism.
Is there a difference in the way that he loves you? Is there still sadness in your eyes you can't deny?
But then we have She Handed Me a Mirror from the Secret Songs opera. This establishes the feel of much of the album past track 7 until Changing Partners. Plotting and drab. There aren't any hooks, especially not in the songs from the opera. Without the context of a narrative, they just read like long rambles. The emotions aim high, but are muted in the execution. Again, there are no drums, and the rhythm is driven entirely by Elvis's acoustic guitar and Dennis Crouch's double bass. And they play it so basic and identical through these songs that it gets very repetitive by the end. The Crooked Line has the benefit of accordion and fiddle leading the song to actually make it stand out. It's a refreshing diversion into Zydeco. But again, we have an Emmylou Harris cameo here that feels wasted. The main album is 50 minutes long, and its weakest material make it feel much longer. Sulphur to Sugarcane should be more fun than it is. It's a playful body trip through the cities of the South, like a group of musical lechers trawling for ass wherever they play. Elvis actually added lines to the song live depending on which city they played in, which is great for a crowd, but I think he just added all of them to the album version, and it makes for a redundant 6 minutes. There's also just something about the main melody that's really irritating. See if you can catch it.
The women in Poughkeepsie take their clothes off and their gypsy blood. In Albany, New York, they look the filthy way I talk.
Did you hear it? It's the same melody as this.
Don't tell my heart, my achy breaking heart.
Yeah, this song is like hearing that line on repeat for 6 minutes. I hope you never unhear it. There are a few bonus tracks depending on which version you have, but they don't add anything to the album that isn't already there. Again, a musically redundant record. One of them is a very random cover of the Velvet Underground and Nico's Femme Fatale. It works better in this setting than you'd think because the original's music is so simple, but you can live without it. Same with Dirty Rotten Shame. It just blends in with the drab second half. The most interesting bonus track is What Lewis Did Last, Elvis's version of the Omi Wise murder ballad. He performed both songs with Kate and Anna McGarrigle in 2001, and before his song, he admits that it's basically fan fiction. He wanted to write a better ending to Naomi Weiss's murder than John Lewis gets away with it and only confesses on his deathbed. How I read this song is Elvis imagining Lewis about to be executed for military desertion. From what I could find, he was never military, he was a clerk, and despite once being infatuated with Naomi, killing her, and being haunted by his crime, he's long forgotten her face and voice. So his last act is to dig up Naomi's grave for a locket of her hair to take with him to death.
He broke through the glass for a lock of her hair. He dug up the grave, but the coffin was bare.
She escapes him in death, and he's left without personal closure for his crime, his true punishment. But because the song is mostly from his perspective, it ends up sounding more sympathetic to the murderer than to the victim. Despite Elvis's goal when writing it, it doesn't take Lewis to task. That's a consistent issue with Costello. Even when he tries to write about women supportively, or even from a woman's perspective, he can't get past his own male-dominated viewpoints. His women only exist in relation to men. Cis-hetero, to be clear. Despite that, I will say the song hits harder and is tighter than much of the second half of the main album, so it probably could have been swapped in and not harmed it. Secret, Profane, and Sugarcane is almost really good. All of its pieces are there, it works stylistically, and aside from the harmonies, it sounds great. It just goes on so much longer that its own momentum can actually carry it. I always reach a point when I listen through the whole thing of realizing, oh my god, it's still going. The very last album is only 3 minutes shorter and is a breeze to listen to. And the very next album is even longer. It's a full hour with 3 more tracks. And I never reached that point with it either. So it's fitting that the majority of this album's songs are old, because in hindsight, it's pretty obvious that Elvis saved his best material for the next one. Now, Costello's brushes with country go all the way back to his very first album, namely 2 of its outtakes. But by 1981, he was firmly considered part of the British new wave scene. And then right on the heels of the album Trust, which featured a bona fide country song on it, Costello and the Attractions flew to Nashville to record an entire album of authentic country covers. It stands out in his first run of records by not being beloved, but it is more appreciated and respected in hindsight. However, while I do like this album, I go back and forth on how much exactly, and I decided its flaws were significant enough that it had to rank fairly low. Number 28, Almost Blue. His country albums are not all at the bottom of the list. These are just flawed in ways later albums aren't. But let's start with the positives. For one, Almost Blue is a genuine artistic statement. The album wasn't strictly going to be country covers at first, just songs with a blue feel. True to that, the final track listing is primarily about two of country's biggest and best themes, which resonate strongly with Elvis's life at the time. Drinking and divorce. I mentioned his failed first marriage before, and this was about the final year or so where it remotely had a chance. And he was drinking. The track listing is mainly of songs 30 plus years old by that point, so there's the sense that Elvis picked songs that he didn't just enjoy, but connected with in some way personally. It's easy to hear him sing Loretta Lynn's Success and immediately think about how the breakdown of his marriage directly correlates to his career taking off and him indulging in some sex and drugs and rock and roll.
Success has made a failure of our home.
As early as his first album's outtakes, Stranger in the House, and all the way back to his Flip City days, it was clear Costello understood country, its use of a situational metaphor and wordplay, in a way that's almost tortured in its cheesiness, but is played achingly sincere. You can easily imagine George Jones's Brown to Blue, one of several Jones cuts covered here, as a blueprint for that.
They changed your name from Brown to Jones and mine from Brown to Blue.
Never mind that George recorded a version of Stranger in the House with Costello. It's a bonus track in the Rhino reissue. And it is so much worse, by the way. It does not work. It's up there with Michael Bublé's Santa Baby as comically no homo.
He gets the feeling that it should belong here.
But for this album, Elvis sings every song like he intimately understands its drunken heartbreak. Even he commented 2 years after its release, "I listen to that record now and think, God, I was never this depressed, was I?" He's always been an expressive vocalist, for better or worse, but this is a context where his strange but emotive singing voice works surprisingly well. Some of the original singers of these songs, while incredibly talented, were so showy and show business in their performances that they felt nowhere as sincere as Elvis does here. Just in the way he conveys the sheer heartbreak and hopelessness, I think he improves on Don Gibson's Sweet Dreams, Merle Haggard's The Bottle Let Me Down, and Charlie Rich's Sittin' and Thinkin'. He can't remotely touch Loretta Lynn or Emmylou Harris, but it's a good effort otherwise. So then why is Almost Blue so low on the list? Well, remember, this isn't just a country album. This is an 80s country album, so all of that customary schmaltz and cheese is drowning in gloss. Just the most sickeningly saccharine, sterile production. The pedal steel on this album is upfront and heinous in its relentless whining. John McPhee is a great guitarist who can rock a pedal steel, and he did great work on Elvis's first recordings, but here it's just pouring corn syrup all over these songs. Almost Blue was produced by Billy Sherrill, who was a massive name in popular country all the way until his death in 2015. He also wrote track 10, Too Far Gone. He was the progenitor of countrypolitan music, the much smoother, slicker, string-drenched branch of country that he helped build through the 70s. There are plenty of classics in this style that still hold up today. The first song named in PBS's article on Countrypolitan is George Jones's He Stopped Loving Her Today, which is an incredible song and nowhere as oppressively produced as this album is. But 70s and 80s country has a reputation for being Nashville's glossy nadir, where that slickness turned into a slop of shiny grease. And even here in the early 80s, it dulls and distracts from the heartbreak and sincerity. That said, there are 3 songs where Sherrill's instincts were right on the mark. The second track, Sweet Dreams, and the album's one hit and another George Jones cover, Good Year for the Roses, both save the swell of strings and backing singers for the choruses and the final verse to heighten the intensity and make them crescendo nicely.
Sweet dreams of you as you turn to walk away.
The rest of the verses are understated in comparison, and the third track, Success, lets Steve Naive drive the song with his melodic piano rather than the pedal steel.
We used to go at walking hand in hand.
But almost every other song feels like the steel and keyboards were mixed to get in the way of the actual content of the song. Even ones which I know Elvis especially connected with, like I'm Your Toy, a deep cut co-written by one of his biggest influences, Graham Parsons.
When nobody knew, nobody saw. Do you remember the way you cried?
Even the album opener, Hank Williams' Why Don't You Love Me Like You Used to Do, is played at a blistering punk speed that makes for a really cool rendition and an exciting introduction. But the more you re-listen to it, the more you hear that over-polished, shrink-wrapped production holding the energy back.
Same old trouble that you always been through. Why don't you love me like you used to?
If you can get past how the album sounds, I wouldn't say any of these are bad covers as far as what the band is doing. The songs do get old once you get past Good Year for the Roses, and they blend together into a characterless drone until we get to the one song I flatly don't like, Big Joe Turner's Honey Hush. It's a presumably tongue-in-cheek misogyny song that I've just never liked to begin with. But being an old rhythm and blues single, it's also just sonically out of place on the album. I assume it's a holdover from that original Blue concept, but it's the penultimate track after 9 weepy divorce ballads. It probably would have worked better if it was much closer to the opener, except that track has way more energy than this. Elvis's version of Honey Hush is so stiff and restrained by the production, it's crying out for some looseness. There's a live version on the expanded reissue that's a lot looser and livelier, and it sounds much better. John McPhee's guitar has such a good stank on it. But I still don't like the song at a bass line. All that said, the album closer is an incredibly bright spot. The second Graham Parsons cover, How Much I Lied. The pedal steel is gone, Steve's gorgeous piano is up front and center, and the performance and the production are in perfect synergy. I like it more than Parsons' original.
This fancy that I'm on, it's been going on too long. It's time to stop pretending things are real.
Despite how low its representatives have ranked so far, I'm going to gush about the first decade of Elvis's records. It's one of the most fruitful periods any artist has ever had, especially when the attractions are involved. Almost Blue was the first major misstep in his recording career, not because it was a random country album, he does country really well, but because it's the first of his albums that just sounds horribly dated decades later. And wouldn't be the last before he split from the Attractions. It was also notably the first of several albums recorded without his original producer, Nick Lowe, who got Elvis perfectly, way more than most producers he ever worked with. Nick had plenty of country bones in his own body, and he was a no-fuss producer. I can't help but wish we lived in the universe where Nick also produced this album. I bet it would hold up remarkably well in comparison. But sadly, Nashville has the monopoly on popular country. It probably wasn't going to be recorded anywhere else with anyone else. Elvis's next album would be another heavily produced stylistic shift with another new producer, but in a way where everything works and nothing is wasted. It makes the dip that occurred right before it feel so much like a wasted opportunity. While we're on the subject, let's discuss an element of Elvis's records that's not going to come up much beyond this first handful on the list, because it tends to be consistently good. Their polish. Even though he was associated with early British punk and new wave, and even though his original producer was bash it out now, tart it up later Nick Lowe himself, Elvis was always a student of popular music. He rarely put out anything that did not have some good time or polish on it, sonically or lyrically or compositionally. There were times where there was way too much polish, and that's why they're down here on the list. But even his first album, £1,000, 16-hour recording on cheap 8-track equipment in a dingy studio, the songs themselves, and even to an extent the performances, were not unpolished. Whether by talent, road testing, or luck, those songs from front to back were ready for recording. Now, I'm not one to inherently call a lack of polish a negative. I love punk rock, I'd be dumb if I did. Some of my favorite albums sound like driving through a dentist's office. But Costello has one album in his catalog that I would describe as unpolished in a negative way, because it clashes with what his music does well. The funny thing is, it's only an issue on the songs where he should have known better. Number 27, When I Was Cruel. This came out in 2002, after 4 years without an album of wholly new material, already a recurring theme in this video, and it was his first in 6 years that wasn't a collaboration. This period seemed to be something of a creative trough for him, and I'll go into more detail on that when we get to the follow-up from the year after, because if I understand the situation correctly, it's most relevant there. But he returned to recording his own music with 3 major building blocks: One, songs built around simple loops and programmed drums akin to hip-hop, the influence of which we touched on with Wise Up Ghost from the following decade. But relevantly, his final single with Warner Brothers from 5 years earlier was very hip-hop, The Bridge I Burned, a kiss-off piss take to Warner Brothers to get out of his contract, and probably also to Bruce Thomas. This is the attitude he brought to the album. 2. Although it's credited to Costello's solo, this is actually his first album with what would become his second backing band. Steve Naive and Pete Thomas returned from the Attractions, and supposedly they tried to convince Elvis to bring Bruce back, but he outright refused and instead brought in session and band veteran Davey Farragher on bass. Elvis was so pleased with the group that he's kept them around ever since, dubbing them the Imposters. And 3, he's working with multiple producers at once, Kieran Cahill, Kieran Lynch, both spelled differently, and Leo Pearson, plus Elvis himself. They're credited collectively under his recurring pseudonym, The Imposter, which he used for the similarly hip-hop influenced single Pills and Soap in 1983. Nice bit of connection there. It looks like all 4 mixed and produced the album at the same time, which might explain a few things. The album has a strong start. We open with the lead single, 45, a garage rocker Elvis wrote in 1999 when he turned 45. It connects his age to the end of World War II in 1945, records played at 45 RPM, and 45 caliber guns. It finds an unlikely connection between cycles of life and death, the passage of time, and the comfort of his lifelong love of music. It's a song by a man keenly aware of his age.
Here is a song to sing. To do the measuring. What do you lose? What do you gain? What do you win?
Then we get to one of Elvis's great character songs about a total douchebag, Spooky Girlfriend. Narrated by a showbiz slimeball about his protege, it's more broadly about cis-hetero male fantasies of women, not just subservient to their selfish desires, but enthused by them. Yeah, for the record, fellas, this ain't your spooky girlfriend, ladies only. Sonically, it's an example of what this album does best, when it leans into the hip-hop influences and builds itself around tight loops and atmospheric instrumentation to create a, well, spooky tone.
I wanna paint you with glitter and with dirt. Picture you with innocence and hurt. A shutter closes, exposes the shot. She says, are you looking at my skirt? When you say no, she says, why not?
Then we get to the second single, Tear Off Your Own Head, It's a Doll Revolution, named after a gloriously mistranslated bit of Japanese text Elvis saw once. It's an explosive bit of garage power pop, and the song where Elvis sounds like he's having the most fun, though nobody in the band is doing a whole lot. It's all energy, built around what sounds like forced feminization, but is probably just a remark about masculinity. If the last verse is any indication, he doesn't necessarily disapprove.
Make somebody a pretty little wife, but don't let anybody tell you how to live your life.
And the fourth track is a personal favorite, the title track. Technically one of 2. Number 1 is a B-side, and you can hear it on the companion compilation, Cruel Smile. Number 2 is built off a sample of the first 2 measures of Un bacio e troppo poco by Mina, with spy movie guitars and brief skitters of Steve's piano dotting the soundscape, while Elvis describes an industry show and airs all these stuck-up rich people's petty cattiness. Judging by the title drop, he seems to miss the days when he was a little punk asshole biting back against everyone. Maybe then he could shut these people up and get them out of his face.
Things haven't really changed that much. One of us is still getting paid too much.
Notably, When I Was Cruel number 1 is much more specific. It seems it's either directed inward, a scathing self-criticism of his past infidelities, or a laser-targeted teardown of someone in his life. Judging by the stories in his memoir, either is possible, which we'll discuss when we get to the follow-up.
Why did you leave your happy home? Why did you travel far abroad? So you could sleep with strangers.
Not many Costello albums open with such good and distinctive 1, 2, 3, 4 punches like this. But if you pay attention, flaws have already revealed themselves, and the record's a bit spotty from here. Soul for Hire is one of the more compelling songs in its subject and sound. It's narrated by a lawyer who hates himself for all the pain his career has led him to perform. Us on YouTube might have kinder views of lawyers these days, but as a celebrity and a divorcee, Elvis probably hasn't had great experiences with them. This was notably one of 2 songs written for the film Prison Song, and built off the same low-pulsing, scratching beat. And I think the songs built off of electronics are what the album was most supposed to sound like.
Every evil man to and desire God to be more than just a soul for hire.
But for me, the cracks become obvious with Tart, another slower track built around the imposters, with Steve introducing each verse with an elegant piano hook. It combines fruit metaphors with the British slang for a sexy and assumed promiscuous woman, following one such lady through a judgy and unfeeling world. The issue isn't the main verses or choruses, which continue the more somber, atmospheric tone that I think this album does well.
Is there something you crave cause you say that you only feel bitterness? Would it kill you to show us a little sweetness?
It's the bridge and outro when Elvis and the band kick things into gear and... It somehow has no more energy than the rest of the song. Put a pin in that. We then have a pair of tracks called Dust, featuring all of the imposters in a dark, grooving protest in favor of humanity, or anti-oppression, as I've always read it. The whole band essentially develops their own beats, putting it in the context of the album. Realistically, these should be highlights, and they almost are.
Why do they taste the sugar? But when they made money, here come the Lamb of God and the butcher's voice, son, yeah. Kept your mouth well shut, appeared to turn your coat. Now there's a name for you, but it's stuck in my throat.
But they're a bit blown out, and I never understood why they're in 2 separate halves like this. As soon as the year of the album's release, Elvis combined and condensed them into one unified track live, and it sounds like a complete song. Going back to the 2 halves, they sound incomplete in comparison, like 2 overlong ideas for a song, and he hadn't edited them down yet. Another track, Alibi, has this same issue. It's the second longest after the title track, but where that developed a setting over the repetition of its sample, this is more repetitive in its lyrics. It doesn't change much over its 6.5 minutes, and I got the sense it was another song that he recorded without editing himself. That said, it's saved by the imposter's dark groove and, keyword, atmosphere, and being one of Elvis's most sincerely bitter and betrayed tracks. There's an unobscured edge to it that even his earliest, ostensibly angriest material doesn't have. And unlike How to Be Dumb, he sounds like he knows what he's doing this time. I came around on this song eventually. When I Was Cruel is probably Elvis's biggest grower album to me, and Alibi is the biggest grower of its individual tracks.
You deserve it because you're special. Alibi, alibi. Maybe Jesus wants you for his sunbeam. Alibi, alibi.
Going back to my issues with Tart and Dust, Alibi is one of the few tracks that doesn't sound blown out. The sound of many of the heavier, louder tracks is over-compressed, and Elvis's voice is pushed all the way to the front. This brings me to another song that should be a highlight, the Latin-tinged penultimate track, Episode of Blonde. In the same vein as the title track, Elvis plays the boisterous anti-hero, cackling to himself about the follies of celebrity, with some of the album's most colorful lyrics and imagery. But once again, everything sounds restricted. Nothing in the mix or the instrumentation has the energy he's asking for, and that folds back into his performance. He sounds like he's trying to be as loud as he can without waking the neighbors.
Can you still hear me? Am I coming through just fine? Your memory was buried in this simple box of pine.
What really holds this album back is the subject of a debate that stretches back to the 90s. It's a tiresome debate that only music nerds really care about, but bear with me, I promise it's important. The loudness war. That's right, it's time for English major Miki to sit back while former music production major Miki wakes the fuck up. With the advent of digital workstations, digital mixing and mastering, and digital formats like CDs and MP3s, musicians and engineers started mixing their music to be as loud as possible. Compressors and limiters are standard audio tools, but when you push them, you can make every instrument in a song as loud as each other, and thus, theoretically, equally present when played back on, say, radio or streaming. Most of Elvis's records avoid this, though. He's an old-school musician who doesn't generally overcompress his music. This is one of the few albums of his that sounds dominated by compressors. What does that matter, though? Well, keep in mind, every sound in an audio file, vocals, instruments, effects, reverb, everything takes up space in a mix. When you overcompress the mix, you force them all to fight for the same space, and you start losing information. Crucially, you lose dynamics. Your quiet parts are at the same volume as your loud, and that, ironically, can sap the energy out of a song. If everything is loud, nothing is loud. I looked up this album on the Dynamic Range database, and it averages a really low 5 decibel range. Even the vinyl version, which will inherently have more dynamic range being analog, averages a below par 9. Nothing necessarily sounds clipped, but the record definitely induces headaches in me. Elvis is not the kind of musician who benefits from loudness war type production. I would argue nobody does, but here it restrains the energy of these songs rather than enhances it. To make it worse, like Kojak variety, the instruments sound sterilized and flat, and it emphasizes how Pete and Steve barely have anything to play. They're almost sleepwalking through this album. Only Davey's bass has any real body and oomph. The other guys might as well not even be here. There is novelty in how loud and present the electric guitar is. That actually wasn't the case for most of Elvis's music up until now. Usually he's a rhythm player pulled back in the mix, and the other musicians have more of the focus. But here the guitar is loud, sharp, and right up front. But it's also very thin, and it makes the rock half of the album sound like there are whole frequencies missing from the mix. I like Dissolve, My Little Blue Window, and Daddy Can I Turn This, 3 more garagey rockers, and almost highlights of the album for me, but they sound like the home cassette demo versions of themselves, and not in a good way.
The precious little words that I could say, your stupid tears will have to wash away. Well, I was a gloomy soul, never thought I'd see a brighter day. The dark and teary blows those silver clouds away. Earrings are jangled before the scene. She slaps your face like a tambourine.
There are more standout tracks past the first 4, though. One song that completely breaks through the album's production issues is 15 Petals. Ostensibly written in tribute to the 15 years he spent with his wife at the time, it's one of the few songs that has exactly as much energy as it asks for. Nervy acoustic guitars, blaring relentless horns, and Elvis hollering over all of it. This song is a blast.
I love you twisted and I love you straight.
Europe and Japan also got an extra track, Oh Well, the second song written for Prison Song and co-written with Q-Tip. It feels like a direct sequel to Soul for Hire, using the same beat, but slowed down to intensify its bass pulse, and distilling the narrator's self-loathing into a lament for a life wasted. It's a shame it's excluded from the North American version, because I don't think the album's complete without it. It is included on Cruel Smile, though.
Life is just passing us by. Oh well, oh well.
And when you pair that song with the main album's closing track, Radio Silence, you can detect some commentary on Elvis's career at the time. It's another loop-based lament, where Elvis is trapped in interviews, radio performances, growing piles of incomplete songs, the homogeneous repetition of a professional musician's life. And he's over it. The verses end with maintaining radio silence from now on. He sounds like he's ready to retire completely. And as we'll discuss further down the list with albums before and after this, his career and personal life would have justified it. It's a sober ending to the album.
This better be worth all of the breath I'm wasted, maintaining radio silence from now on.
Though the Japanese version ends on a much lighter note, an orchestral cover of Smile from the Charlie Chaplin film Modern Times. It's also included on Cruel Smile. He recorded it shortly after the September 11 attacks as one of a few affirmations of life and hope, whereas most of the album was recorded earlier in the year. It's a good rendition, and Elvis is in strong voice, but it's some sonic whiplash after such a dirty digital record. It sounds so clean that it makes the album's production issues stick out even more. And that's why this album doesn't rank very high for me. Whereas Goodbye Cruel World and Almost Blue are obviously overproduced, I can't tell if this is over or under in comparison, but it's definitely underserved by its production. Elvis and his co-producers started with simple, hip-hop inspired ideas, and most of everything else feels like an afterthought. As far as the rock half of the album, I don't think his co-producers were up to the task. There are a few highlights there, and good ideas that I think Elvis fleshed out better live. More on that later. But the electronic tracks, smoke 'em. Considering what was just around the corner in his personal life, and his creative winning streak immediately after, I get the sense that When I Was Cruel was Elvis shaking off the cobwebs of the last few years. He just needed to get an album done and out there so he could make his own music on his own terms again. I know I've been there. All of that said, I can easily see this album ranking much higher on other people's lists. This has big fan favorite vibes. Just a year ago, it ranked even lower on the list, but it kept climbing as it grew on me. It's probably Elvis's sloppiest record overall, but it's also his biggest grower for me. Even if I didn't rank it especially high, but it sounds like it could be your bag, I say go for it. I mean, this is one of the 2 albums that made music writer George Purvis into a fan. No reason not to give it a shot. It's a credit to Elvis's output that we're only 7 albums deep, and we're now past the point of most major criticisms. I'm not going to have a whole lot bad to say about anything from here on out. So to make this interesting, let's discuss the first exception to my criteria, and the first of 2 compilations. Which is actually 2 compilations. Number 26, Taking Liberties, and 10 Bloody Marys and 10 How's Your Fathers. I've combined these 2 into the same spot because they're basically the same album. They collect non-album A-sides, B-sides, and outtakes from Elvis's first 4 records, and their track listings are almost identical with only a few key changes. It's important to remember, at the start of his career, Elvis was signed to different labels in the UK and in North America. He accompanied his first 3 albums with a few non-album singles in the UK, and then when the albums were sold in the States, his label Columbia added those singles to them. Except, this year's Model and Armed Forces had 3 album tracks total removed to make space for them. Thus, Taking Liberties is the American compilation with those missing UK album tracks, while 10 Bloody Marys is the UK compilation with the non-album A-sides. Outside of those switch tracks, they're the same compilation. Now, it is worth noting that the modern releases of these albums include all original tracks, plus those A-sides, as essentially de facto album tracks. Radio feels like it belongs on this year's Model to me. Most available expanded reissues also include every other track in these compilations as bonuses, to the point that I also think of Big Tears and Crawling to the USA the same way. But for the sake of the video, let's look at Taking Liberties and 10 Bloody Marys as time capsules of Elvis's early years, through the lens of the songs that didn't make the album. It's basically how I justify putting them on the list. On that note, one of the fun aspects of these compilations is hearing early or alternate versions of songs that did make the album. Sometimes Elvis cannibalized an older B-side or demo for an album track, or he and the Attractions tried songs in different styles or tempos to see what worked best. We saw that multiple times with Goodbye Cruel World, and we see it a lot here with 1980's Get Happy, which had so much material to work with, and the band recorded so much of it. The compilations open with Clean Money, a B-side originally planned to open Armed Forces, and a tribute to their one-time tour mates and childhood favorites of mine, Cheap Trick. It's a blast of punky energy that Elvis reworked into Get Happy's opener, Love for Tender, which is the better song, but I'll always love this gleefully furious early version. Notably, it features rock and roll revivalist and Nick Lowe's bandmate in Rockpile, Dave Edmunds, on backing vocals. Keep him in mind for later. When I compare most of Elvis's alt takes and early versions for their final albums, I tend to be of the mind that they made it to the album in that form because they worked it out into its best form. The biggest exceptions are when overproduction saps their character, like Goodbye Cruel World. But we have two alt takes here that I don't like as much: the Black and White World demo and Clown Time Is Over version 2, for the simple reason that Get Happy has an energy and bounce that these versions don't.
I was looking at the black and white world. It seems so exciting, while others just talk and talk. Somebody's watching where the others don't walk.
The Rhino Records reissue of Get Happy, a 20-track album, has a 30-track bonus disc. That's how much they recorded. And most of it is alternate takes and demos like these. I think that's where these belong, as documents of the creative process. It's interesting to hear Black and White World with a country twang, or Clown Time in a slow ballad form, and then compare those to the final album and see how those lyrics and melodies worked better or worse. But I don't think they hold up as well when placed outside that context. Luckily, Get Happy was such a fruitful period anyway. We have 6 other tracks recorded during that time, some of them old songs Elvis hadn't recorded yet. Girls Talk has the distinction of being one of Elvis's first songs specifically written for someone else, in this case, Dave Edmunds, and it was one of his bigger hits in the UK. His version is much more upbeat and bouncy, it has brighter production, and is played in a higher key. But Elvis's has a darker atmosphere that better sells how the narrator is probably supposed to be a loser or a creep, and he has the eternal secret weapon of Steve Naive on piano. We'll talk more about Get Happy's background when we get there, but the general conceit was to sound like the soul pop of the 60s. Soul found a big audience in Northern England in the 70s, what they called Northern Soul, and especially obscurities and B-sides. Get Happy's biggest single is a cover of one of these, as is Getting Mighty Crowded, featured here. And I assumed that Just a Memory was too, but it's actually an Elvis original. With just his voice and Steve Naive's keyboards, he perfectly captures that longing, romantic late-night regret. High-tension vocal strain and all.
Losing you is just a memory. Don't mean that much to me.
Whereas Getting Mighty Crowded was written by behind-the-scenes legend Van McCoy for Betty Everett in the 60s. Elvis can't touch the original. Betty has an incredible voice.
And so you see, it's getting mighty crowded. It's too crowded for me.
But he gives it the gusto it deserves. He and the Attractions at least make it their own. Hoover Factory and Ghost Train are notable for, 1, being recorded entirely by Elvis, and 2, being some of his earliest written songs, dating back to his early bands Rusty and Flip City, though he didn't record these final versions until after Get Happy for B-sides. Hoover Factory is a surprisingly unsarcastic tribute to the real Hoover building in London, his attempt to preserve a mundane piece of the city in the same vein as the Beatles' Penny Lane or the Modern Lovers' Roadrunner.
Green for gold, green for action. From Park Rock to North Acton.
While Ghost Train is a sharply sarcastic snapshot of the mercenary world of unsigned, underappreciated working musicians. Both tracks are interesting glimpses into his years as a working-class, semi-professional band member and the culture around him, which was only a small part of his first album compared to relationships.
Roll up to the Ghost Train non-stop through the city. Step right up and show your face with only one the pretty ones.
Dr. Luther's Assistant is another very old track recorded by Elvis around this time, plus Pete Thomas on drums. Despite its cheery, psychedelic tone and lyrics that suggest the titular assistant's sexual misadventures aren't necessarily unwelcome, Elvis sings them with such unhinged glee that it's hard to believe there's nothing untoward happening. It's a lurid picture behind the scenes of polite society. He'd delve even deeper into that pool over the next 2 years.
Dr. Luther's assistant. He'll get on top of you when you lie. Resistance.
In comparison to Get Happy, 1979's Armed Forces doesn't have as overwhelming a showing here, but it has some of my favorites. Right after Girls Talk, we have Talking in the Dark, probably sequenced together as a joke. It's an unlikely sincere love song about missing someone because you can talk with them for hours and hours about nothing, though Elvis still approaches it with bite. My favorite part is Steve's grandiose monophonic synth solo, which makes the song sound like an indiscreet era Sparks track. Amusingly, Elvis later wondered what the hell he was thinking to leave it off the album. I like the song that took its place plenty. I think it suits that album's flow, and I wouldn't have swapped them, but Talking in the Dark is worth highlighting here. A big favorite of mine comes near the end of the compilations, Wednesday Week, a high-energy, high-speed rocker about passions just as wild that are over just as fast. The third verse slows down dramatically for the humbled morning after, which Elvis says was inspired by Wings' Band on the Run. This one I would have been happy to see on an LP.
You start acting like a zombie, someone wants to be so gay. You think you wanna jump and find me, but you won't give a damn about Wednesday week. Oh, what a letdown when the battle was finally won.
It's followed immediately by Elvis's cover of Roger and Hart's My Funny Valentine, his first ever recorded cover as Elvis Costello, and famously covered before by Frank Sinatra, Miles Davis, and I think most relevantly to Elvis, Chet Baker, who will come up again later. Elvis's version is a haunting take on Chet's understated version. It's him solo again, just his hushed voice and the lowest strings on his guitar, recorded one day while waiting for the attractions to arrive. It's a short version, only a minute and a half, but its dark, stark atmosphere predicts at least one of his most terrifying depictions of obsession in the following decade.
Stay, little Valentine, stay.
Backing up a bit to directly after Talking in the Dark in the track listing, we have one of my favorites on these compilations and of all of Elvis's B-sides, Radio Sweetheart. It and Stranger in the House were two country outtakes from My Aim is True. Almost Blue was treated as an oddity when it came out, but Elvis was influenced by country since the beginning, especially the work of Graham Parsons. Like I briefly talked about earlier, Stranger in the House showed that he understood country's cheesy but sincere use of metaphor for heartbreak, and I think he pulled it off, thanks in part to his high-tension but highly emotive singing, and of course John McPhee slobbering his pedal steel all over it.
There's a stranger in the house no one will ever see, but everybody says he looks like me.
I do like the song, but John Steele works better as an addition, not the focus, which I think is what elevates Radio Sweetheart into a real hidden gem. More acoustic-led country rock, it has an infectious rockabilly swagger and sing-along chorus. It was one of the very first songs Elvis recorded with Nick Lowe and members of Clover when he first signed to Stiff Records, which makes it one of our earliest peeks back through time to his previous band, Flip City. They were a country rock, rhythm and blues outfit that were apparently not very well liked and didn't go anywhere, but My Aim is True is very much an evolution from their sound. Until their demos were found and bootlegged, and Elvis included his early demos as bonus tracks on My Aim is True reissues, this song was our first glimpse at that band for those of us who never saw them live.
Play one more for my radio sweetheart. Hide your love. Though we are so far apart, you got to hide your love.
Interestingly, this is a remix with fewer backing vocals and effects on Elvis's voice. The original mix wasn't re-released until the Rhino reissue of My Aim is True. I think I prefer the original. The remix keeps Elvis's vocals panned to the left, which was a weird choice, but they're ultimately equal. It's too good a song either way. So that means these compilations start with Clean Money, Girls Talk, Talking in the Dark, and Radio Sweetheart. That's almost as good a 1, 2, 3, 4 punch as some of the LPs higher up this list. 10 Bloody Marys gets the leg up because it then continues into two of my favorite extras from this year's Models album cycle, Big Tears and Crawling to the USA. Tiny Steps isn't long after. Big Tears and Tiny Steps were B-sides, though Elvis wanted the former on the album and regretted that it didn't make it. It's the most lyrically brutal of this period, about the misery of city life and as close to You're a Bunch of Sheeple as he ever gets, if he wasn't a clever songwriter. It features the Clash's Mick Jones on lead guitar, playing what Elvis likened to a police siren. Crawling to the USA was made for the Americathon film soundtrack, but was otherwise part of this album's cycle. And while it's not as crisply produced, it is everything good about this era. A garage pop jam, great guitar and organ, and hooky and melodic as hell. Another favorite of mine.
Saw it late one night on a secret channel. It's farther on along the tunnel.
And Tiny Steps continues the album's themes of men's commodification of women and their bodies, with Elvis sneering at a man who uses a girl like a doll. What it lacks in the hooks of Big Tears, it makes up for with similar lyrical bite.
Wooden bones and pretty lashes. Iodine for your baby's gashes.
On that note, Tiny Steps was an important transition to Armed Forces from this year's model, because it just sounded like this year's model. After Elvis heard All Mod Cons by The Jam and appreciated how much of a creative step forward it was for them after their first two albums, he decided he didn't want his next to sound like the last, and he's largely kept to that for the rest of his career, even when he probably should have. As much as I love all the material from this album cycle, I think it's fair that Big Tears didn't make this year's model, despite Elvis's regrets. It's not because it's not a good song, but because I am generally a proponent of consistency and cohesion within an album. Not as a hard rule. We'll talk later about at least one where the lack of both is the fun part, and anyone who heard my music knows I could never hold to it myself. But when a really good album maintains that distinct but consistent sound and tone all the way through, that can be what elevates it from a collection of good songs into a unified artistic statement. This year's model is crisp, punchy, gritty in all the right places. It has some of my favorite production of any record ever. And Big Tears has just too much reverb. It's very washy. I honestly don't know where I would put it if I tried to resequence the album to include it. Radio Radio already sounded like it belonged on the album before it was added to it, but Big Tears would feel like a sonic non sequitur. There's also something to be said about the limitations of vinyl, chiefly the track listing. You could only fit under an hour's worth of sound onto an LP, and that required musicians to keep their records tight. Get Happy may be 20 tracks, but it's 20 tracks of bangers. It did not need to be 25. Elvis may wish that Big Tears wasn't left off this year's model, but I think there was space enough for Radio Radio, and that's it. I'm of a similar mind with Crawling to the USA and Tiny Steps. All good songs worth hearing, but they never needed to be more than extras when the complete albums are so good as they are. But that's the benefit of these compilations. They let tracks like these stand more on their own merits. By grouping them together by album cycle, I did not showcase that here. Sorry. If I had to pick the better compilation between the two, I have to give the edge to 10 Bloody Marys. Of the songs shared between them, it has the slightly more compelling track sequencing, for whatever that's worth to non-turbo nerds. But of the swap tracks, Night Rally, I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, and Sunday's Best are all good songs. But Watching the Detectives, Radio Radio, and What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding are all-timer great songs. It's not a fair contest. Either version has 3 tracks you've already heard, and they, and many of the songs not quite reaching the quality of the main tracks, are why these two records only reached number 26 on the list. But if you're a newer fan who's already absorbed the first 4 records, and they weren't the expanded reissues, either of these is still worth your time for a more complete image of Elvis's early years. And if you want a more complete image of the rest of his first decade, for that we jump ahead to 1987 with the second exception to my criteria and the second compilation. Number 25, Out of Our Idiot. Elvis's labels stopped switching tracks around between regions with Get Happy, so this one compilation was released everywhere to serve as the latter period companion to the last two. Several covers, pseudonyms, B-sides, and extras gathered together into a collection I find just a hair more compelling. You get an idea for the weird ride you're about to take with the first track, 7-Day Weekend, made for the Club Paradise film soundtrack in collaboration with reggae legend Jimmy Cliff. That's not reggae. It's inexplicably a loud rock and roller. Even Elvis wondered why they did that. But I really enjoy the song because, 1, putting Jimmy on a rock track isn't an obvious choice, and he works really well. And 2, the song's a damn jam.
Where's this point of no return? When you swung it, all you man. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weekend.
From there, we get Turning the Town Red, which I briefly discussed as one of the extras from the Goodbye Cruel World album cycle. One of its best tracks, not on the album. The theme for the show Scully that completely avoided the overproduction and is hooky as hell. This compilation is where you'll find all the best extras from that album cycle I mentioned earlier. The covers of Get Yourself Another Fool, Withered and Died, Baby It's You, and the original version of Inch by Inch, Little Goody Two Shoes, in all of its Jerry Lee lunacy. Some of the best songs from that period and on the compilation.
I can't help myself, 'cause baby, it's you.
Punch the Clock also has two B-sides here. Heathen Town paints a party town like Las Vegas like it's the gateway to hell, which would feel more sarcastic if Elvis's showbiz temptations didn't destroy his first marriage. It's sonically very bright yet dour, and I think it's more overproduced than the actual album. I like the song, but it feels like a harbinger of doom itself.
With one eye on a place in Texas prison and the other on a girl dressed as a rabbit.
A much better track is further in the compilation, The Flirting Kind, as good as any song recorded during this cycle. Steve's gorgeous piano dances around Elvis's story of unattainable love like the best songs on Imperial Bedroom. There's also a lot of production on this track, a lot of extra instruments and effects, but they don't get in the way. They enhance the song like they're supposed to. This one should have been on the album.
Make love like a punishment, so they call her the flirting kind. The flirting kind.
The People's Limousine was a collaboration with T-Bone Burnett under the pseudonyms The Coward Brothers, Henry and Howard, a group they resurrected recently. The project effectively heralded King of America, Elvis's first album since his debut, primarily recorded without the attractions. And after Goodbye Cruel World, I can only imagine this song was a big breath of fresh air for him. It's a driving country rock track about sex, crime, and trigger-happy cops in Florentine, Italy. Infectiously hooky and melodic, it's always been one of my favorites on the compilation. T-Bone may outclass Elvis as a singer, but the two blend really well.
She looked like someone's girlfriend. She looked like a dream. She looked as unlikely as the people never seen.
Shoes Without Heels and Baby's Got a Brand New Hairdo were also from the King of America period, likely planned for the album but kept as B-sides. They're both interesting insights into that album's creation because of how they contrast the material that did make it. The album was recorded in the wake of Elvis's first marriage, but there's not as much bitterness as there is regrets and hope for the future. He saved the bitter stuff for after. But we hear some of it in Shoes Without Heels, where Elvis plays the abandoned patsy who convinces himself that the girl who broke his heart will walk straight back once she's done breaking some other prick's heart. Its tone has more in common with Almost Blue than King of America, which says a lot about how he and T-Bone redirected that album's path.
Watch you walk away from him while he gets down and deals. Oh, he'll watch you walk away without heels.
On the other hand, Baby's Got a Brand New Hairdo is just a fun rock and roller in the vein of 7-Day Weekend, about a pretty girl. But it's notable for being one of the songs recorded for King of America with the Attractions, who otherwise only appeared on one track on the final album. The original plan was for it to be half acoustic with T-Bone session musicians, half electric with the Attractions, but ultimately the session crew stole the Costello show. The Attractions were already fracturing from Elvis after the last two albums, and this did not help. When he and the group reconvened for Blood and Chocolate, much of which was the darker leftovers from King of America, they recorded it, according to Elvis in his memoir, in spite of each other, or even to spite each other. This song is a glimpse into the album that could have been before the blood started flowing.
The baby's got a brand new hairdo. But doesn't she look so good? She looks like Billy Bonner. Said I wish you would, I wish you would.
Most peculiarly, there's also a sequel of sorts to American Without Tears from King of America, but recorded in the gap between Blood and Chocolate and Elvis leaving his labels to sign to Warner Brothers. The original is a wonderful song about English immigration to America in World War II, placed against Elvis's guilt towards his first failed marriage, and his mixed feelings towards America. I'll have a lot to say about it when we get to that album. This sequel detaches itself from Elvis and instead tells a specific narrative of a former soldier with PTSD marrying an English woman, taking her to the US, and the both of them suffering internally. I don't like it as much as the original, which I find far more emotionally resonant, including its use of accordion. Really, never has an accordion been so devastating. The music here is instead brighter, faster, and in a higher key, and Elvis seems to be doing a Bob Dylan impression. It's more a semi-humorous addendum than an equal to its predecessor, but it's an intriguing glimpse into his creative mindset in the lead-up to Spike in 1989. And credit to him, Elvis recorded the entire song himself, and when he describes the traumas that both characters brought with them to America, it hits.
The war wound that he carried home wasn't really visible. When the bullets were forgotten, she looked down and miserable.
But a big highlight of the compilation comes right after People's Limousine, recorded back in 1979 between Armed Forces and Get Happy, but went inexplicably unreleased until 1987, So Young. It's a cover of a song by Australian rock band Jojo Zepp and the Falcons from '78, kind of swaggering pub rock by way of ska, about being young and hot and on everyone's radar. The Attractions version isn't hugely different, it's slower and with fewer time signature changes, but Elvis emphasizes the song's ska and reggae influence with some excellent bass work by Bruce Thomas, Pete Thomas holding down the groove with plenty of hi-hat, and Steve Naive playing an organ that the Specials would be proud of. I'm shocked it wasn't released as a single. It would have easily been a hit in the two-tone ska scene. It's possible it was never intended to be released, judging by the fact that Nick Lowe is credited with producing it, quote, at gunpoint. Somebody didn't want to be there.
So young, so young. So young, so young.
Another surprising highlight comes near the end of the compilation, Black Sails in the Sunset, an outtake from Trust that was saved as a B-side for Blood and Chocolate. It's as pretty as anything on Trust, perfectly crisp production by Nick Lowe and Roger Bashirian, Steve Naive dancing all over the piano, and Elvis's hoarse, froggy voice, an issue I'll discuss more when we get to that album, isn't as strained as a lot of the tracks that did make it. I'll admit, the song's subject does seem muddled, outside of the theme of death far from home, but I'm surprised it didn't make the album.
You tell the truth sometimes, but you wouldn't know it if it hit you.
Another good cover here is of Smokey Robinson's adorable love song, From Head to Toe, recorded during the Imperial Bedroom era. It's largely a note-for-note cover, and Elvis isn't usually so directly cute in his love songs, but I like it a lot either way.
I got two lips that long to kiss you, and when they speak, they say they wish you were mine.
Imperial Bedroom had some of Elvis's better pseudonyms. The album's title track was left off and used as a B-side, recorded entirely by Elvis with a piano, bass, and drum machine, and credited to Napoleon Dynamite and the Royal Guard. Elvis reused the name for Blood and Chocolate too, and no, the film does not take its name from this. I'm surprised too. It feels like a movie made by people who listen to Elvis Costello, but there you go. The song contrasts its stately elegance with the debauchery of wealthy, upper-class cheaters on their wedding day. Basically the mission statement for the album, despite not appearing on it. And the compilation closes on one of its weaker tracks, the B-side The Stamping Ground. Another Elvis solo track, it's a folky song about a woman's favorite pub where everyone knows her and nobody likes her. Imperial Bedroom itself draws more from Elvis's own infidelities that ruined his first marriage. In that context, this song feels like him airing some of his grievances towards his ex, Mary Burgoyne. And it's credited to the emotional toothpaste. Maybe he knew.
Big fella on the front door knows your face. The barman pretends that he saved you a place. But when your back is turned, they say she's older than she tells.
There are a few other tracks I'm not big on. The cover of Yoko Ono's Walking on Thin Ice for a tribute compilation is more novel than it is interesting on its own merits. It is noteworthy for being the first time that Elvis worked with New Orleans music legend Alan Toussaint, who produced it, but they'd record much better collaborations in later years.
Walking on thin ice, I'm paying the price.
Also, same situation as the previous compilations, I've never been a fan of the alternate versions of two songs here. This take of Blue Chair was recorded during King of America and released as a single, but the final take was recorded with the attractions for Blood and Chocolate. And this first version sounds like he hadn't nailed down the tone or the melody. It feels like he's still feeling it out as he's recording it.
Now it's just you and me, my blue friend.
Same with Big Sister, an early version of Big Sister's Clothes from Trust. Elvis was down on the slow, gloomy reggae style of the final version, but this early up-tempo rock cut sounds like he's making it up as it goes along, and I don't think it's as memorable. Slowing it down and making it atmospheric makes it more unique. It stands out a lot more on Trust. I'll explain why when we get to that album.
Ship to the slaughter. Oh, this must be love. Are your sons and daughters in a strangle in a kid club?
But there's only one track here that I just flat don't like, and it's the Ennio Morricone-styled spaghetti western send-up, Town Called Big Nothing, recorded for a western film, Straight to Hell. I love the acoustic guitar-only intro, but once the story kicks in, it's nowhere as grand as it wants to be. But that's still 3 to 4 weak tracks out of 21 that showcase Elvis's eclecticism as well as his consistency over several years and styles. Out of Our Idiot was re-released on iTunes in the late 2000s, right as I became a lifelong fan in high school, and it's always held a special place in my heart on the same level as one of his LPs. Like Taking Liberties and 10 Bloody Marys, it might not hold a candle to the best albums of this period, but the best of its inclusions do. We move from a compilation to another collaboration, one that's also, at least primarily, another covers album. There will be even better collaborations down the line, and certainly more celebrated, but I imagine this one flew under a lot of radars. Hopefully I can convince you to give it a chance. Number 24, For the Stars, with Anne-Sophie von Otter. I don't have the CD for this one either, so here's some relevant albums instead. Von Otter is a Swedish mezzo-soprano opera singer with the kind of talent that makes you go, what the hell am I doing? Elvis was a fan of hers and previously wrote the 3-part suite, Three Distracted Women, for her and the Brodsky Quartet in 1996. One of those songs and the Brodskys will both come up again later. She's the primary vocalist of the album, and Elvis only duets with her or backs her up on about a third of it, but he was producer and arranger, wrote or co-wrote the majority of the songs, and plays instruments throughout. Also, Steve Naive is here, so I say it qualifies for the list. Only 3 of Costello's songs appeared on one of his albums before this, so you can argue it's not a cover album in the strictest sense, but that is the bulk of the album. Outside of his own material, they tackle a wide swath of very songwriterly tracks, from the Beach Boys, ABBA, Tom Waits, Ron Sexsmith, Paul McCartney. The same holds true here as for the previous covers albums. Critical as I was of them, they felt like they were made out of genuine love for those particular songs. Elvis didn't just ride the same broken bicycles as everyone else. And in that same way, For the Stars is not an exercise in cheap and easy cover choices, or what I call the social media cover. You know, I did a pop song but made it opera, watch it go viral. This is as much a celebration of songwriting and songcraft as it is of Von Otter's vocal skills. I have to give major credit to her as a vocalist, and not just for the obvious. Something that can easily get lost in a cover is how much that original vocal performance defines the song. I listened to several artists cover Costello's music for this video, and it stuck out to me how much character he brings that the cover often lacks. His vocals may not be pretty, often his undoing when duetting with or covering other artists, but he makes up for it by inhabiting a song's characters and emotions. For a relevant example, someone could easily sing Baby Plays Around prettier than him, but they could miss the fragility and resignation that makes that song work so well. Not Von Otter. She is a more practiced, disciplined, and richer vocalist, but remember, she comes from opera. In opera, whatever language you're singing in, and whether you understand that language or not, you need to understand the lyrics and the intended emotion. Luckily, Von Otter is also a good actor. She brings that emotional conveyance to this. She sings Baby Plays Around just as hopelessly as Elvis did, and every breakup song that follows. If this album has a unifying tone, it's Lonely Rainy Nights. Much of the album is very spare, Baroque backing, piano and strings primarily, performed by a collection of incredibly talented, mostly Swedish musicians, underneath Von Otter's deeply emotive vocals. She eschews operatic power for a heartbreaking gentleness, though she gets to really show her vocal range in Green Song and her version of Costello's I Wanna Vanish.
Whether in wonder or in decent taste.
The album was noticeably mixed to push the vocals up in front of the instruments, when it probably would have benefited that lonely nighttime atmosphere to pull her back more into the mix, and especially Elvis when he joins in on vocals. The exceptions are ABBA's Like an Angel and Tom Waits' Take It With Me. Sophie sounds just right in those. The big highlights for me are the Costello-penned opener, No Wonder, which showcases Von Otter's voice in an almost psychedelic folk context, which makes for a striking introduction.
There is a secret no one knows. I set my face, I changed my clothes.
The original track Rope is shuffling and mournful with such a cool, haunting atmosphere. Fellow goth types, check that one out. It gives me 4AD vibes.
Look beneath the waves, the seabirds diving down into black water.
I love both Tom Waits covers here. They interpolate Broken Bicycles, sung by Von Otter, with Paul McCartney's Junk, sung by Elvis, and they sound like they belong together. Plus, ABBA's Benny Andersson plays accordion, and you know I like some accordion.
Like all broken bicycles out in the rain.
Motor cars, handlebars, bicycles for two.
Take It With Me does abandon Waits' distinct, bleary, drunk atmosphere, but they replace it with utter beauty. If you're going to top Tom Waits, that's one way to do it.
The ocean is blue as your eyes. I'm going to take it with me when I go.
On the other hand, their version of Nina Simone's The Other Woman may be the best example of the strength of Von Otter's restraint. Over-singing a song that doesn't need it is, ironically, a great way to ruin its power, and she doesn't over-sing in the slightest. It's perfectly understated like Nina's original, and devastating because of it.
He'll find her waiting like a lonesome queen.
In contrast, I love the richer, Baroque, almost celebratory makeover they give Ron Sexsmith's April After All. It brings the bittersweet optimism of the original more to the forefront, and I think it's a great interpretation.
And rain will start to fall. It's April after all.
But the album's highest peak is right in the middle. Their version of ABBA's Like an Angel, with Benny Andersson on piano, wipes away the studio gloss of the original to reveal the gorgeous melodies underneath. To me, it's the definitive version of the song.
Oh, too soon, like an angel passing through my room.
It's followed by the absolutely heartbreaking Green Song, built around a solo by cellist Svante Henriksson. Von Otter's vocals are shatteringly tender. Costello almost keeps up with her in his guest verse, and the imagery is so longing and sad. I cry every time I listen to both of these songs.
But there's someone that I long for. Oh, where have you been? As the red earth lies under a covering of green.
That said, the album's weakest moments are probably obvious. There are some songs you just can't expect a cover to match. And despite giving it their all, they don't reach the heights of Pet Sounds or Revolver. I am biased, they're two of my all-time favorites, it's probably not fair to put that on them. But where Von Otter perfectly sold the understatement of The Other Woman, I think her more practiced, elegant singing style undercuts the emotions of these covers. She gets real close to matching Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, but nowhere close with You Still Believe in Me. Peak Brian Wilson was the master of that tender fragility. R.I.P. In that same way, weirdly enough, despite my compliments earlier, I don't think Bon Otter quite matches the devastation of Elvis and Burt Bacharach's This House Is Empty Now. Painted from Memory is no Revolver or Pet Sounds, but it was its own heartbreaking lightning in a bottle. Get ready for it. Really, once we pass April After All, as beautifully crafted as the album is, it lacks for tracks as standout and powerful as the first half. Nothing sticks until we reach Take It With Me near the end. If the album were cut down to that in the first 10 tracks, it'd be a contender for my top 10, top 15 at the least. You get a lot of points if you make me cry, okay? Spoiler alert. That said, the album closer, the Costello Pen title track, isn't as strong as the opener, no wonder, but it makes for a charming end as Elvis tries to match Von Otter and just can't do it. But it wraps around to kind of working because, at least in this case, being an almost Broadway-ish pop song, she's firmly in his house now. He also makes some cheeky references to his father and grandfather being trumpet players. It's more than the sum of its parts, which is probably what I'd say about the album overall.
The morning comes, the days are just the time between until the dusk when we can be together.
For the Stars is the soundtrack to a rainy night by the fire, be it romantic or woefully unromantic, and there will be albums later on the list that fit even better into that context. But I wrote this part of the script while listening to the album during a chilly winter morning in my heart print pajama bottoms with a hot cup of coffee, in a moment I can only describe as synergy. The music and Von Otter's vocals are gorgeous and emotionally affecting, and the album comes together into a cohesive whole. It deserves more appreciation than I imagine it's gotten. Like I said, it made me cry. Next, we return to 1983. Despite the stellar accomplishment of 1982's Imperial Bedroom, the band's album sales had steadily declined since the turn of the 80s. To combat this, Elvis enlisted the help of Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, fresh off making Madness into UK superstars for the last 4 years, to help him and the Attractions craft an album made to sell. Not only did they succeed, it was also a pretty good album. And really fucking weird despite itself. Number 23, Punch the Clock. It's easy to call this the sellout on paper, bright, accessible pop tunes produced by hitmakers, augmented by the duo Aphrodisiac's soulful vocals just dropped on top of the mix, and the TKO horns, fresh off quitting Dexy's Midnight Runners, turning every appearance into a rolling cheese wheel. But in execution, this group's stab at chart success feels so enthusiastic and even sincere, and it's just as often tight and controlled as it is reckless and bizarre. I mentioned when we talked about this album's ill-fated follow-up that Punch the Clock has an economy of sound. The key is that there aren't a whole lot of layers put on top of Elvis and the Attractions, aside from Aphrodisiac and TKO. At least not anywhere enough to be distracting like it would the year after. Those two groups only show up on a handful of tracks, otherwise it's just the main band with the treble turned up. They also don't aim for chart success in the most obvious way for 1983. At least from my perspective as someone pretty switched on to 80s British music, but still separated by time and space, Elvis followed Dexy's path to the charts by delving into his soul and R&B influences, and getting Clive and Alan to make it sound good on radio. Madness's success probably had a lot to do with that too. This wasn't the first time they drew on those influences either. 1980's excellent Get Happy is basically their attempt to replicate the output of Stax Records. Punch the Clock is obviously a much slicker, poppier, calculated version of that idea, but I don't think it's unfair to call this, like Almost Blue before it, a sincere expression of Elvis's interests and influences. It doesn't come across as cynical as it might. It helps that a lot of the time, they get really silly with it. The album opens with what could be its tonal mission statement: let them all talk. The TKO horns blast open the record, and it's just a roller coaster from there. At least one of the critics I read was confused and put off by whatever Steve is doing on piano, but I kind of love the chaos. The tone is completely different from where it would end up the year after. There's such a playfulness and abandon that runs through this record that makes it a lot of fun to listen to. It sounds like it was fun to record, even if it probably wasn't. Then we get the hit, Every Day I Write the Book, a smooth R&B groover using the time-worn whole song metaphor for love, in this case writing, and it resulted in Elvis's first single in the US Top 40. In the reissued liner notes, he admits that he wrote this and one other track in a feckless frame of mind early in production, a couple of bright pop tunes dashed off without much to them, but leaving it there does a disservice to his skills as a pop tunesmith. Charm goes a long way, and this song is too playful, bashful, and endearing to write off as nothing more than a reach for the charts. I genuinely like it a lot.
All your compliments and your cutting remarks are captured here in my quotation marks.
In that same vein, the next track, The Greatest Thing, shows that Elvis didn't sacrifice his lyrical skills and knack for wordplay. Mostly. Initially, much of the material he brought to the album continued the behind-closed-doors infidelity of Imperial Bedroom, reflecting his failing first marriage, but the producers encouraged him to brighten things up. Sounds familiar, but it makes sense when you see that it worked the first time. The Greatest Thing is instead a celebration of young love, of old oppressive ideas of man-dominated marriage fading away, and of women deciding their lives and loves for themselves. And he does it at increasing speed until he sounds like Bus Driver rapping Imaginary Places. It's an underappreciated gem in his discography.
Since eyes were long and days were rolling, woman, the manners and the older. Lessons and times haven't changed. Seasons like a tribute of a rose and says the sweet is better suited to the nose. All her fingers.
That said, there is one track where he very much half-assed it, The Element Within Her, which has the immortal chorus of la 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 la. This is the other empty song he, quote, dashed off early in production. But I'd argue it's saved by this album's relentless devotion to melody. It still manages to be hooky, and I usually don't skip it. It also has at least one clever verse at the end.
Back in the bedroom with her electric guitar. He says, are you cold? She says, no, but you are la 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 la.
Elvis is also down on Love Went Mad, which he called a slight and lyrically labored song about life at a nuclear shelter. I kind of love this song. Yeah, its lyrics are nonsense, but it's a microcosm of this album's unlikely goofy charm. In trying to make accessible pop tunes, they get so silly sometimes, and Love Went Mad is gleefully abstract, funny, and weird in a way his fans, They Might Be Giants, would just a few years later.
These focus fractions of the treble clef. I wish you luck with a capital F.
Elvis wanted to switch this one out for one of the B-sides I mentioned in Out of Our Idiot. I disagree. I think you need this song to fully sell the appeal of this album, even if it's at odds with Elvis's pride. But it's not all goofy nonsense. There are two tracks here that are way up there with Elvis's most sincere pleads for humanity, dressed in his outrage toward the fascists in power. Shipbuilding was largely the predecessor for Punch the Clock. Clive Langer asked Elvis to write lyrics for an instrumental he wrote for Robert Wyatt, so Elvis drew on the recent Falklands War and the anticipation of senseless deaths. It's a story about a portside town reopening its shipyard and thriving as industry booms thanks to the war, only for those same families to send their children to die in it. Robert's version was a minor hit, but has gone on to be beloved and is considered the better version, but Elvis's take has a lot going for it. He does try to mimic Robert's softer vowels, which is audibly awkward. You know when you hear it that he doesn't usually sound like that, but compared to Robert's more detached vocal take, Elvis's signature knack for emotional fragility is by far my preference. You can visualize him overlooking this town from a rooftop, dreading the excitement in these working-class families' lives, and lamenting what's about to happen to their young soldiers. Elvis even drew on his own family history for the song, or at least narrowly avoided history. During World War II, Britain sent boats of children to other countries to dodge the Blitz. Elvis's mother and uncle were nearly sent to Canada on one of those boats, but their father changed his mind at the last minute. The Nazis torpedoed one of those boats, ultimately killing half of the passengers, including 90 children, through drowning or from exposure on the lifeboats. Both the combatants of the Falklands War and those children were on Elvis's mind when he wrote these lines.
With all the will in the world, diving for dear life, and we could be diving for pearl.
Steve Naive performs brilliantly on piano as always, but it's jazz legend Chet Baker, there he is, who brings the secret sauce with a pair of beautiful trumpet solos. If Robert Wyatt's version is your favorite, I won't tell you you're wrong, but I don't think anything compares to this. Near the end of the album, we get one of Elvis's first songs inspired by hip-hop, namely The Message by Grandmaster Flash and Mel Mel, and one of his most vicious, biting songs that he directed at a worthwhile target. Don't let Steve's chintzy piano and the clap track fool you. This is a dark song about England's moral decay with the rise of Thatcherism, media's sensationalizing of human misery, blind royalism, and jingoism. It was inspired by man's abuses of farm and domestic animals. Basically, Elvis learning how the sausage is made and saying, yeah, that's life under capitalism. This is notably the first appearance of the Imposter pseudonym, which he used to sneak the track to number 16 on the British charts.
Give us our daily bread in individual slices and something in the daily rack to cancel any crisis.
For that matter, the second half of the album overall does not try so hard to be cheerful, at least not lyrically. Charm School, Mouth Almighty, and King of Thieves are the songs where Elvis's true mental state slips through, aching in light of his marriage's collapse. They lean much more on the love gone sour and unsympathetic partners of previous albums, though the music maintains its upbeat tone, drive, and earworm melodicism. These songs are good examples of the album's economy of sound compared to its successor. The production doesn't cover up their darkness or distract from it, instead providing them an immediacy, and in turn, the lyrics and subjects give these bright, approachable pop tunes a surprise edge.
Love is when nothing but a farce, trying to make us silvers out of the thousands. But I used to shoot my mouth up till you had enough of me once or twice nightly. The vocals want a human sacrifice, and look at that girl, young, hungry, and
As if to drive this home, the album closes with The World and His Wife, a soul pop party about a drunk, incestuous family gathering that is just gleefully debauched. Elvis originally wrote it as a, quote, solemn folk song, but rearranged it for the album as a bilious knees up, which is such a fun phrase to say. And that's what makes this album special. Even when catering to the charts, Elvis and crew had a knack for the unexpected and unobvious.
Kissing, step outside to cuddle and confess. Nothing at all is much more of a mess.
But probably my favorite song on the whole album is The Invisible Man, such a cheerful song about escapism into film and distractions against the fear of fascism. Evergreen damn song. But really, I love it for a very obvious reason. It sounds like They Might Be Giants.
I wanna get out while I still can. The statue got me high. The statue got me high.
2 years before they even put out their demo tape. If there's a way to sell out with style, it's right here. Just a great pop song.
There's the stars around me painted on the ceiling above. And who can you turn to? And who do you love? I wanna get out while I still can. Press around like...
However, the only time the album's playfulness really fails is the one song I've never liked, the centerpiece of the album, TKO Boxing Day. Named in tribute to the horn section, Elvis wrote a ham-fisted, macho chest pounder, and boy does it not work. He started his career making fun of himself for being the opposite of the rock stars who write songs like this, and that's ignoring that it's got some of his laziest lyrics.
Put the number to number, the cotton to guilty, put the storming to slumber, and the put to future.
Goldstone went further and balked at him going from protesting domestic abuse 2 years earlier to seemingly celebrating it here. And you can certainly read the lyrics that way, but that's probably giving it too much credit. We can at least call it the most vapid song he ever wrote. And this is the same album where half of a song is la 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 la. And that points to why, even though I like Punch the Clock a lot, it isn't higher on the list. It's an entertaining, energized pop record that I think has more going for it than its mixed to positive reputation, but it's still a backstep into chart chasing after an absolute stunner of a record, which capped off one of the best winning streaks any new artist has ever had. Not to spoil it to absolutely no one, but these three we've already talked about are the only albums from Elvis's first decade that we'll see in the bottom half of the list. That said, switch out TKO for the flirting kind and it goes in the top half, just putting that out there. But either way, out of the non-masterpieces that Elvis put out at this time, Punch the Clock is easily the best and totally worth diving into. You might need to be in the right mood for it, though. Let's go back to the collaborations with an album that confused a lot of people when it came out. The first time Costello went classical. In 1989, while promoting his new album Spike, Elvis became a fan of the Brodsky Quartet, a British classical string quartet performing around London. Come 1999, to his surprise, he learned they were fans of his. And after forming a friendship with the group, they began collaborating that November. The project eventually took form after Sybil read about a professor in Verona answering letters addressed to Shakespeare's Juliet. And he was inspired by a letter he received himself from a young soldier in the Gulf War. Before long, they had an entire song cycle based around letters. Number 22, the Juliet Letters with the Brodsky Quartet. The core strength of this album is how it's a genuine collaboration. Despite the assumptions of the rock and classical music press at the time, this is not simply Elvis singing on top of a string section to be taken seriously. All 5 musicians had a hand in the music and lyrics. One member of the group would bring in an idea or phrase to the table, and the rest would build on it into a complete piece. Elvis even protests the idea that this is a crossover. To him, quote, "All we were doing was writing some songs together." With the help of Kevin Killen producing and engineering, told you he'd show up around here, the group produced an astonishingly rich and full record, considering how few people are involved at any one time. The Brodskys are also uncannily good at following Elvis's strengths of melody, storytelling, and songcraft. To his credit, he took the chance to learn musical notation for the record, which changed his music and its scope from here on out forever. And as we'll hear throughout the record, he also dramatically expanded his vocal skills. After the somber instrumental intro, Deliver Us, the first lyrical track, For Other Eyes, is a confession letter by a woman who let her distrust and paranoia get the better of her and destroyed her relationship. Right away, it shows the group's knack for melody and building an intense atmosphere, and how well the quartet blends with Elvis's voice.
And I found a number that I somehow dialed, and a woman answered, a woman smiled, and she hung up on the silence, unperplexed.
Though the album's concept is letters, the band gave themselves some freedom with what qualified as such and what the letter would say. As track 3, Swine prompts the listener to expect the unusual, as it's an unhinged piece of political graffiti sliced into a wall.
You're a swine, and I'm saying that's an insult to the pig.
Elvis tended to oversing on the previous album, Mighty Like a Rose, to rapidly diminishing returns. But his theatrics actually work in this setting, not just because it's inherently theatrical, but because he's playing characters, and he saves the excess for the ones who ask for it.
Now that you've finished your life, this riddle is the work of my little penknife.
Expert Writes brings us back to the album's inspiration, a character like the professor who answers letters to Juliet, herself directly named within the text for the first time. The Brodskys set the scene like a low-lit study stuffed with bookshelves, where the, quote, compassionate and romantic soul sits at his desk writing by candlelight. Elvis belts a shirt-rending wail of heartbreak, as if to inhabit both the professor's and the writer's grief together.
I once loved someone the way that you do, but I had to let her go. I lived with my regret.
The song then leads into Paul Cassidy's somber instrumental, Dead Letter, which Elvis says in the reissue notes, darkens the already melancholy mood into one of sadness and loss. And I specifically read that as implying the worst outcome for either or both the woman or the professor. We're gonna get a lot of that bleakness in this record. Not so much the next track. It's one of my favorites, though. I Almost Had a Weakness, a letter from a crazy old aunt to her nephew refusing to share the inheritance. Elvis lets loose as the character while the Brodskys amplify the woman's erratic behavior. I see the song as the album's turning point because this is when the group really start having fun, both with the concept and just in action.
Thank you for the flowers. I threw them on the fire.
The strength of the album's concept is not just the flexibility of what counts as a letter, but its content. Obviously, the group generally wrote them within a song structure, but the words can be beautiful, poetic, and earnest, or direct and stark. And if there's anyone who doesn't gussy up their words, It's a child. Why is both heartbreaking and even terrifying. A child writes to their feuding parents, unable to understand what's happening around them. The music and Elvis's voice are so tender and tense, you feel as small as this kid. Think back to your childhood. I know, I'm sorry, me too, but bear with me. Think back to your old room and how everything around you was so big, too big. The soundscape for this track is that old, too big bedroom, when the lights are out and something's gone wrong but you don't know what, and everything's quiet now but you just feel so small.
Why is Daddy not here? Are you crying?
Ian Belton did a great job not just capturing the simplicity of a child's viewpoint, but its inherent selfishness, centering everything happening around them on themselves. Does Daddy still love me? Will you take care of me? If you both love me so, why don't you love each other? And then Elvis took it a step further as the child witnesses, again, the worst outcome for this feud.
Mama's gone missing. Dad is on fire.
Even if it's not one of my favorites as a listenable song, it is as a piece of art. It's great songwriting. But the next track, Who Do You Think You Are, is another favorite musically. A jilted lover sits at a cafe writing a vent letter to his partner about all their faults, before finally admitting that he still misses them. Michael Thomas's swaying waltz beautifully captures the seaside setting and the writer's burbling internal thoughts. This is a good example of Elvis's vocal skills during this period, outside of sheer vocal range, how tight and disciplined he was.
1,000 or so tuneless violins thrilling your cheap little heart. Who do you think you are?
Which is not to discount the strength of his vocal range. Taking My Life in Your Hands sees a poor, deluded obsessive writing countless histrionic letters, threatening self-harm if he doesn't receive a reply. But the inherent darkness of that idea is both tempered and saddened by the fact that he never has the courage to send any of them. He's in a bubble of his own torture. Elvis reaches his very vocal peak on this record, and I'm not sure he ever hits a note this high again. One of my very favorites on the album, problematic concept and all.
I can always pretend words I don't have the courage to say with you.
This Offer Is Unrepeatable is up there with I Almost Had a Weakness, both as a favorite of mine and in taking the concept in a sillier direction. It's an artifact of a bygone time when chain letter scams were a thing, like the African billionaire spam emails that succeeded them, and then porn bots. This is an especially devilish letter, promising power and riches beyond human means with some unsettling fine print. Elvis goes full circus ringleader in his performance. He has so much fun that I think he laughs on the very last word.
Would I lie to you? Would I sell you a dud? Just sign on the line. Could you possibly write it in blood?
Death is a recurring theme, and I won't speculate an outside reason, but internally, it is an effective way for estranged individuals to reconnect, or in the case of the next song, for the departed to say one last goodbye. Dear Sweet Filthy World is the saddest of death letters, but probably the one you'd think of first. The suicide note, left behind by someone with nothing but disappointment. The music is as oppressive as their hopelessness, though pockets of comforting melodies punctuate the Brodskys' heavy dirge.
I don't know how he chose the pills or the stupid revolver.
The Letter Home is one of the few tracks to put the formalities of letters into the text, opening with a melodic and rhyming recitation of the address and date. This puts the listener into a false sense of security because the letter proper dives straight into the estranged author's bitterness at their sibling. The kicker is, similar to Taking My Life in Your Hands, the writer doesn't know if the addressee still lives at that house, and they have no intention of writing again anyway, revealing the letter as only a cathartic goodbye for themselves.
And it seems so strange now that he's gone to recall all these games. Though the years have divided us, friendships have strained and broken.
Jackson's Monk and Rose sees the Brodskys dip the most into the well of pop music, written primarily by siblings Michael and Jacqueline Thomas, and inspired by a law firm they knew from their childhoods. I don't know if I would call the music groovy, but it sets an effective, almost nostalgic stroll through the traumas of childhood into the sad realities of adulthood, from brothers hurting their sisters and destroying their toys, to a couple's divorce. Stephen Thomas Erlewine cited this song as a highlight while unfairly dismissing the album at large, but I do agree that this song shows that the Brodskys were a good match for Elvis's pop talents.
Have you got enough strength to carry it off Jackson's Monkey Road?
Elvis gets close to slipping outside the concept and just writing one of his usual protest songs on This Sad Burlesque, a lament for the state of England in 1992, with a hopeful eye towards the future. That was easier in the 90s. Paul Cassidy's composition keeps the tone warm and optimistic, but it's one of the songs that doesn't stick out compared to what's around it.
If it's not a contradiction, please have faith in human nature and have mercy on the creatures in this sad burlesque.
Especially compared to Romeo's Seance, the most striking composition on the album and strong contender for my very favorite track. The letter is a dead lover's words appearing along the walls as his Juliet tries to contact him from beyond the grave. After a gentle, longing intro setting the scene in this quiet, lonely house, they play the driving, percussive rhythm on what sounds like palm-muted strings, which I don't think I'd ever heard on anything other than guitars. It has the effect of this Romeo scratching out the words while the cheerful, relentlessly melodic music is like the reunited couple dancing together in the spirit world. It also has, I think, the only vocal harmony on the album, and just once with Paul Cassidy, and it's gorgeous. I wish they did that more. It's a standout track.
Though you're gone, I don't feel like crying. Romeo is calling you.
I Thought I'd Write to Juliet is one of the few songs written primarily by Elvis, likely because it concerns him directly. It's based on the letter he received from a female soldier in the Gulf War named Constance, who only enlisted to pay for college. And judging by his memoir, that was her actual name and her actual reason for enlisting, and he never said if he got permission to put that in his song. I would have gotten permission first. The song is actually composed of two separate letters. The first is from a fictional receiver of Constance's letter, a snide, cynical writer who only expects this poor soldier to die at war. So they wrote to Juliet to sort out their sordid feelings. Then it plays Constance's letter, depicting her life on the battlefield. The cynical writer's discomfort makes sense when Constance tells them that their words have comforted her in her bleak circumstance. Elvis and the Brodskys sell both the frustrated sneer of the writer and Constance's humble dignity in danger.
Your words are comfort, they're the best things that I have. Apart from family pictures and of course my gas mask.
The song ends on the Brodskys replicating an air raid siren, but then they transition into the album's final instrumental, the soft but discordant Last Post, as if to depict Constance's ravaged battlefield at sunrise. Peaceful, but if she's still alive, the night before will be every night for as long as she's there. The first to leave returns to the well of death with a letter from the departed who believed in an afterlife to their atheist lover. I originally read the lyrics as a similar melodrama to Taking My Life in Your Hands, but about a cheated lover contemplating suicide. Either way, the song is tense and steeped in uncertainty, especially its sharp instrumental coda, like the music follows the internal grip of the living reader's heart as they scan down the page of their dead partner's letter.
Perhaps you'll never know this purgatory, we never could agree.
But before the final track, which has a very similar concept to the last, we get one last note of humor with Damnation's Cellar, a comic song about a time machine and its potential moral and immoral uses, right up until the anticlimactic end of the project. The music has a Gilbert and Sullivan bounce, where it sounds like everyone's having fun, and it's hard not to enjoy yourself listening to it.
They'll never please mankind, so lie back and enjoy it. Stop press, they've just decided to destroy it.
And the album ends on one of Elvis's greatest tearjerkers, "The Birds Will Still Be Singing." The writer, whether beyond the grave or just before it, urges their lover to live and enjoy life after them, the music as hopeful as it is mournful. It's such a beautiful song that Elvis's father, Ross, requested it be played at his funeral. And they did.
If I'm lost or I'm forgiven, the birds will still be singing.
The Juliet Letters is, and was, guaranteed to receive unfair, surface-level reactions. Its actual content stands strong beyond those impressions, and unlike Erlewine, I think it holds up great over multiple listens. I did several for this video over 3 years. Even if there are 21 other albums I ultimately like more, the group's wide-reaching talents and a career-high performance for Elvis on the mic make this an album absolutely worth your time, once you know what you're getting into. Next, let's continue right from here. After the Juliet Letters and the 2 big-budget pop records before it, Elvis and his then-wife Cott O'Riordan wrote the whole solo debut album for punk singer Wendy James. The result, Now Ain't the Time for Your Tears, is fine. Funny note, it was produced by Chris Kimsey, who produced the Killing Joke albums I mentioned earlier, but most relevantly, it featured Pete Thomas on drums. Remember, during Costello's estrangement from the Attractions, Pete was the one member who still played on his records. Writing for Wendy went so well that Elvis decided to just keep making music. He hired Pete and frequent producer/engineer Kevin Killen and rented the tiny Pathway Studios, the same place where he made his debut. But there were a lot of false starts. The studio wasn't right for what they wanted to do, so they moved somewhere else, and did so at least twice. Elvis couldn't play the piano parts for a song, so he hired back Steve Naive. Eventually, Kevin decided he wasn't right for the material and bowed out. Elvis mentions alternating between excitement and despair within the same sessions. The project didn't come together until Elvis bought a Gibson 160E, the same model played by John Lennon, after which he wrote just over a third of the whole album in one night. The Gibson also helped dictate a more stripped-down rock sound for the record. Eventually, they moved to the famous Olympic Studios, where Elvis previously recorded Blood and Chocolate with the Attractions. Along the way, they brought in friend and former producer Nick Lowe to fill in on bass, but Nick didn't like to play anything too complex, so he's only on about half of the album. Luckily, new producer Mitchell Froome, who just co-produced Mighty Like a Rose, worked with a session bassist who could handle the hard parts. Former Attraction, Bruce Thomas. Warner Brothers jumped at the chance to market the album as a reunion with the Attractions, but that's not strictly true. It is, however, the beginning of the band's end for good. Number 21, Brutal Youth. Though the Attractions don't play on the entire album, Brutal Youth often feels like a return to the scrappy rock of Elvis's first 2 albums, though he doesn't abandon the lessons he learned from the Brodsky Quartet and turns the light down just as often. The first 3 tracks betray the album's messy recording, as each one has a different bassist. Nick Lowe plays on the opener, Pony Street, where his fluid bass and Steve Naive's glittering piano set the stage for the album's recurring themes of fraught domestic nostalgia. Then Pete and Elvis come in to kick the doors down on a humorous glimpse at intergenerational conflict, starring a lazy mother and her exasperated daughter.
You used to adore me, but now my light flashes before me for you to view.
Elvis plays bass himself on Kinder Murder, a slower, less frenetic track and one of the album's bleakest, about men's sexual abuses of women, victim blaming, and rape culture at large. The chorus is one of Elvis's most painful. She could have kept her knees together, could have kept her mouth shut.
The officer said it had to be tonight. There's a tear-stained would-be teenage bride, all a family pride in a little Ram Rider.
13 Steps Lead Down is nowhere as dark, but draws on Elvis's years-long battle with alcohol, the title referencing 12-step alcoholism programs. The entire Attractions lineup plays together for the first time here, and for reasons we'll discuss in a bit, it's one of the few tracks that matches their peak years. One of my favorites on the album and of all of the Warner Brothers years.
Cheers and fails on fashion-free rails. The lovers have a walking around on instruments to torture, and one of them is poisonous.
But around this point in the album, my enthusiasm starts to waver, and it's hard to pinpoint why at first. It took me a while, but I came around to liking the next two tracks, the much softer and more understated This Is Hell and Clown Strike. The former is one of a series of songs reimagining the afterlife as miserably mundane. Hell isn't fire and brimstone, but just a life you get sick of, filled with prats you don't like.
The failed dumb one in the big bow tie is very sorry that he spoke. He's mislaid his punchline more than halfway through a very tasteless joke.
And Clown Strike imagines an unequal relationship as a circus, looking back on it, as Elvis describes in the reissue liner notes, with affection and amusement, emphasized by his playful backing vocals.
You don't have to go so far, 'cause I love you as you are.
Both tracks have a more hushed, compressed, understated production, where the instruments don't get in the way of each other and the energy is restrained. The problem, I eventually realized, is that the loud tracks sound like that too. On every track, everyone sounds like they're in a box, and the instruments are struggling against a compressor. Yep, we have another When I Was Cruel situation. Brutal Youth is also held back by its production, not as much, hence its much higher placement on the list, but once you notice the issues, they're hard to ignore. Stephen Thomas Erlewine directly blamed Mitchell Froom, saying his, quote, self-conscious production undercuts the effectiveness of the music and lacks guts. While I largely agree with that assessment, and Elvis does note that Froom and his partner Chad Blake brought in a lot of weird shit that didn't need to be there, I remind you that Elvis co-produced and shares some of the blame. And also, I think the production issues are more subtle than you'd think. When I went to college for music recording, my professors emphasized the importance of cohesion in a mix. You need something to glue all the pieces together. It can be as simple as just a little bit of reverb you used on one instrument added to the entire mix. A light compressor on the whole mix can do it. Recording a tape will basically do it for you. Those little details can bring a mix together and make it feel even more musical. Whatever they did on Brutal Youth seems to be the opposite. Every instrument sounds like it was put in Tupperware and shoved in a corner. Nothing has any space to breathe, and nothing coheres with anything else. The only instruments not stifled by the mix are Elvis's vocals and Pete's distracting, untuned snare. Steve gets it the worst. Except for the first few tracks, especially Pony Street and 13 Steps, his keyboards are hard pan to the left. Hard pan to the left, and have barely any presence or air, which hurts some of the best songs on the record. You Tripped at Every Step is musically gentle and emotionally hard-hitting, about a relationship that should have ended long ago, a sad reflection and anticipation of both of Elvis's first two marriages. Steve's piano drives the song, and the mix stuffed him in a corner.
Your despairing tread was angry and unstable. You never suspected, just as that cartoon mouse went undetected.
Same with London's Brilliant Parade, a beautiful recollection of Elvis's childhood in London with several specific references. It's a nostalgia trip that doesn't merely drown in the past, but looks towards the future from that position in the past. It's one of the songs born from Elvis's time working with the Brodsky Quartet, and you can hear that in its elegance. Steve elevates the song in the way that he often did on the classic Attractions records, and sometimes they pan him towards the middle, but not nearly enough.
Now the bankrupt souls in the city are finally tasting defeat.
Sulky Girl was even made the lead single, which feels bizarre to me because it sounds like an unfinished demo. It's in a similar vein to Kinder Murder. It takes the lead woman character's side in subjects of sex and men's piggishness. I read it like a protest of slut-shaming.
Just some stupid little know-it-all. You thought you looked easy. He's not that astute.
I generally like the song, but like some of When I Was Cruel, there's not anywhere enough energy in the stuffy production to make up for a pretty muted performance by the Attractions. Just About Glad has the same issue, a louder power pop, disappointed romance track that nearly recalls this year's Model in its slobbering sneer. The band feels more into it, but all of its energy is dampened by the sterile mix. It honestly makes it the weakest track on the album for me.
The greatest love affair you never had. I'm just a bad man.
For that matter, the Rhino reissue has a few early versions recorded in Pete Thomas's basement between studios. Just him, Elvis, and Nick, no Steve yet. Those sound fuller and clearer than the final album. Something went very wrong somewhere. Erlewine insisted that Nick Lowe should have produced and not just subbed in on bass. But keep in mind, excellent producer that he was, Nick had basically retired from production at the turn of the decade. There was certainly a better choice out there for what Elvis wanted to do, though. That said, a few tracks aren't really harmed by the production. The first 3 opening tracks feel like the 90s alternative rock that Elvis inspired. The production manages to make them feel contemporary. They even remind me of a personal favorite album that we won't talk about for a while. Clown Strike is one of the few tracks that feels tailored to this production, so I give it a pass too. But after hearing the 2006 live performance with Alan Toussaint and the Crescent City Horns blowing it out of the water, I may never go back. And aside from pushing Steve's piano out of the way, the sound suits the depiction of a mundane afterlife in This Is Hell. 20% Amnesia and My Science Fiction Twin appeal to me especially because they turn up the distorted bass and lean into Elvis's wry sense of humor. The former's a goofy mockery of easily swayed voters, his frustration paired with the most appropriately inappropriate keyboards from Steve. He sounds like he's going mad trying to understand other people.
From rage to anesthesia, 20% amnesia.
And the latter draws on Elvis's career-long alter ego, who's inherently more famous and successful than Declan McManus ever was, though he says in the liner notes that it's just a satire about a man who does 5 things at once. He at least approaches it with a relaxed laugh at himself.
They asked how in the world he does all these things, and he answered superbly.
And the penultimate track, the hazy breakup doo-wop waltz, All the Rage, seems to intentionally go for a retro feel, so it's not harmed by the mix either.
Although I'll never be unhappy as you want me to be, still it's all real.
I'd even argue that 3 of these songs are actually enhanced by the production. On the surface, Still Too Soon to Know feels like a less emotionally gratifying rewrite of Baby Plays Around from Spike, a masterpiece of resignation and romance. We'll get to it. Still Too Soon to Know is a less powerful cheating song in comparison, but what it has that Baby Plays Around doesn't is the oppressive atmosphere of the mix. You feel like you're Elvis sitting in the dark in the corner of a room, wondering for hours about your relationship and your partner after you caught them cheating, and never finding answers.
I wonder was this ignorance or bliss? It's still too soon to know.
And the album closes on Favorite Hour, the only song recorded solely by Elvis, with just his voice and simple piano accompaniment. It's his most heartfelt protest of the death penalty, one he's especially proud of, and the production only enhances the heartbreaking reality of death. The Rhino reissue has an early take with Pete and Steve filling out the mix with drums and organ, but the final version is a near pitch-perfect example of less is more.
Now there's a tragic waste of brutal youth.
But one of the album's deep cuts, Rocking Horse Road, might be the secret highlight. Its boxy production helps it feel like the musical version of an old faded Polaroid. Elvis explores this quiet suburban street and recalls a life long past. It's the sound of walking down your old childhood street after you moved away, seeing all the ways it's changed over the years, and knowing that the formative image you see when you think of that place is gone forever.
I know I must not look back, 'cause part of me is waiting still. There on Rockin' Horse Road for you.
Elvis never intended Brutal Youth to be a concept album. He emphasizes in the liner notes how erratic and abrupt it all came together, but he does admit that it's backwards looking in its subject matter. There are strong recurring themes of the past, nostalgia, childhood homes, family dysfunction, and failed relationships. You could frame it as a concept album set in a fictional London suburb, On a Pony Street or a Rocking Horse Road, capturing the sordid lives of normal people from decades past, including their later years or their untimely ends. And that's why, for all of my criticism of his production, I'm very fond of this album. Elvis was in the second decade of his career as a musician, exactly 2 decades if you count his bands as a teenager. And Brutal Youth feels like him taking an hour for himself to remember where he came from. I admit, nostalgia plays a part in my appreciation for this album, too. Here in Sacramento, we used to have a chain of stores called Dimple Records, and my local store was my favorite place to visit for years. The grand majority of every CD I own came from Dimple Records over the course of my teens and 20s. It was where I truly became a Costello fan, and not just for the big, obvious albums, but for the hidden gems like Brutal Youth. For whatever goddamn reason, the same handful of albums were always available at Dimple used, several copies, and super cheap. And I never understood why, because they weren't huge sellers that you expect to find returned or used. But they were also good albums. Who traded all these in? But it was these albums, alongside his first 3, that were my main introductions to his music. And they made me a fan. Dimple Records sadly shut down in 2019 after the owners decided to retire. My favorite store? Gone forever. So when I listen to Brutal Youth, an album I bought there, and I hear his sad remembrance of a lifelong past, I get it. Not about anything else that happened in 2019, but I get it. This actually takes us directly to the next spot on the list. I bought this next album with Brutal Youth at Dimple Records, and that combined with them being recorded and released close together inextricably links them in my mind. Kojak Variety was released in between these two, but this next album will always be the real follow-up to Brutal Youth for me. And fittingly, we go straight from the Surprise Attractions reunion to their unsurprising permanent breakup. Number 20, All This Useless Beauty. It's a credit to the band and the production that this album is as good as it is, because this is the final result of a heavily compromised idea. Elvis had unprecedented support from Warner Brothers when he signed in the 80s, but come 1996, a change in leadership left him with barely any. He originally envisioned this project as a star-studded double album, with the self-deprecating title A Case for Song, as in, music locked in a case, never to be heard by anyone. He knew it wouldn't sell. Ultimately, it was reduced to 1 disc and mainly recorded with the Attractions, and they only showed up for a paycheck. But with the help of some excellent production by former Beatles engineer Jeff Emerick, and not for the first time, the resulting album, All This Useless Beauty, turned out pretty damn good. While the Case for Song idea fell through, much of the music here began as collaborations or were written with or for other musicians. The opener was co-written with Amy Mann for her band Till Tuesday, a song I briefly mentioned before, The Other End of the Telescope, one of Elvis's many great breakup songs. Till Tuesday's version is a much more heavily produced, country-tinged affair set in a higher key. I think it's ultimately the better version. Elvis on his own can't match Amy's vocal talents, let alone with Elvis harmonizing with her. And while this new take does feel like the 90s adult contemporary version, it has some extra lyrical bite, as Elvis rewrote some of the verses to lean into the regret of the relationship. Plus, what Till Tuesday didn't have was Steve Naive doing what he does best on piano. See Brutal Youth? This is why you don't waste him.
You see me off in the distance, I hope, at the other end, at the other telescope.
It's followed by a personal favorite of mine, Little Adams. An interesting recurring theme on the album is Elvis drawing on his Catholic upbringing and, agnostic as he is, finding some sideways beauty in it. Little Adams is a dramatization of Judas's betrayal of Jesus, dripping with gorgeous poetry and Steve's piano, and it's driven by a rarity in Elvis's music, a synth arpeggio. It's a standout track.
In the particle of me that cares for this, I betrayed those little atoms with a kiss.
Distorted Angel is even more directly about his upbringing. It was inspired by an angel statue that his parents set up in his room as a child. Catholic guilt may be a thing, but I don't think they intended the angel to scare Elvis as much as it did. And now he can't get that omnipresent gaze out of his head. The song is a steady drift through his thoughts and memories, punctuated by more of Steve's glittering piano, which is what really makes it special.
I was taught to believe you were looking down on everyone.
The title track is another favorite of mine, originally written for June Tabor and primarily based around Elvis's voice and Steve's piano. It's a somber, disappointed look at a young woman's hopes and expectations of romance compared to her reality, a prince who's less than charming.
I wrote it in Italy, and I saw a woman in a picture gallery looking at all these beautiful pictures of classical antiquity, and then her eyes left the wall and came down to her late 20th century lover. And she had this look in her eyes like, where did we go wrong, you know?
Despite the funny anecdote, there's one line that breaks my heart every time.
She held his head like a baby and said, "It's okay if you cry."
Later on the album is a track that feels like its lesser sibling, Poor Fractured Atlas, this time about a man. Based around a more direct, Moonlight Sonata-ish piano, it's a sympathetic look at a writer who lets his impotence, literal or otherwise, leave him angry and alone. It's not as musically or emotionally strong as the title track, but it has some power if you imagine Elvis is looking in the mirror.
Now you can't be sure of that 10 times years since he punched a hole in the fabric.
I talked about Complicated Shadows earlier. It was originally written for Johnny Cash, who declined to record it, and Elvis wouldn't record his original country idea until 2009. But I've always preferred this version. Making an outlaw country song into a rock song is less obvious, and it helps it to stand out. It's also a much more dynamic version, as they intercut the studio take with a live performance that brings the house down. One song that tries to rock that hard and doesn't quite manage it, but makes for a fun swerve, is Shallow Graves. It's another one of the handful of songs that Elvis wrote with Paul McCartney that either had yet to record. And you can kind of tell, Paul has an approach to rock and roll and rockabilly that leans goofy. Even this song, about the grand equalizer that is death. It's not the strongest song on the record, but the attractions at least give it some muscle.
Bless the parkers like the rich, they all end up in a ditch. In this world of fools and knaves, even good children got shallow graves.
There are two tracks that never totally clicked with me. Why Can't a Man Stand Alone is an impassioned plea against toxic masculinity and its harm on men and women. Elvis wrote it for Sam Moore, but Sam declined. Elvis thinks it was because it had too many words for Sam's style. I think it's just the most undercooked song on the record. It doesn't have as much passion as Elvis managed on R&B songs before and after this. It also ends just very awkwardly.
Why can't a man
And Starting to Come to Me is an attempt at a jovial bubblegum rock and roll style that doesn't land. It's one case of lyrical dissonance, something Elvis does all the time, that doesn't enhance such a vicious song of double faces and gold diggers. It's a shame because I like the melodies, I just wish the music had as much teeth as the vocals and lyrics.
Blend with the sweet smoldering, send out the martyr when it's starting to come to me. Come to me, come to me.
On the plus side, the album has a standout ending stretch. Its last three tracks are some of the best of the Warner Brothers years and beyond. You Bowed Down is a brilliant pop song, written for Roger McGuinn of the Byrds, and it makes great use of a 12-string guitar. Where Starting to Come to Me doesn't connect to its own music, You Bowed Down syncs just right, the jangle and psychedelia complementing a song about selling out one's morals and artistry for industry brown-nosing. It's something Elvis eternally battles against. The only downside? Steve Naive gets shoved in the corner again. You were doing so well, Jeff!
But all the applause is forbidden, not yours. You bowed down.
Its Time is a shattering R&B-tinged wail of regret in the aftermath of either a one-night stand or a relationship with about as much love that should have lasted about as long. The song builds up a hip-hop style looping drum sample, apparently discovered by Elvis's son Matt, and Steve's angelic keyboards launch the song into the stratosphere.
Mercy, it's time that you went. Mercy, it's time that you went.
And the album ends on one of Elvis's most heartbreaking confessions on the level of Favorite Hour. I Want to Vanish. It's a spare piano and string composition featuring the Brodsky Quartet, also written for June Tabor, but strongly resonant with Elvis's own state at the time, as I'll discuss in a minute. It's tender and beautiful and always chokes me up.
I've given you the awful truth. Now give me my rest.
Despite several excellent tracks, this album was never going to rank higher than the very tip of the top 20 for me, because even compared to Brutal Youth in some ways, it's one of those band reunions where the magic is gone. There is an incomparable cohesion between Elvis and the Attractions in their first decade together. His good songs elevated to great by their talents, but All This Useless Beauty is just that band as workhorses. They showed up for a paycheck and didn't fuck it up. There's a reason that Elvis toured the album as just a duo with Steve Naive, because his piano is the only instrument that stands out and lifts the material into something exceptional. Elvis describes their tour together as them saving these songs. I suspect he's not proud of this album. George Purvis's book about Elvis and the Attractions for On Track, quote, "Every song, every album," deliberately excludes the 90s albums. He says it's because there's enough in that story for a second book, but the subtext is that they're not really Attractions albums. Elvis himself felt the same way. He wrote in his memoir that, in hindsight, the Attractions truly ended with 1986's Blood and Chocolate. Quote, "We put our names on a couple of other record jackets in the 90s, but despite containing many good songs and some vivid performances, those records really could have been made by anyone, and sometimes they were." They reused the album's original title, A Case for Song, for a televised live show and video that serves as a solid wide-lens look at Elvis's work with and without the Attractions at the time. There are great sections with just him and Steve, or short sets with the Brodsky Quartet. The Attractions overall are in good form. You wouldn't get the sense that Elvis is ready to drop them as soon as cameras are off. But it's hard to watch the show when you know how he felt behind the scenes. Remember I Want to Vanish, and how the album was largely material written for or with other musicians? That's because around this time, according to Elvis, he preferred to hear his own music through other voices. This turned out to be something of a low period for him, one where he constantly questioned his own career, and he wouldn't really climb out of it until some drastic life changes in the early 2000s. It didn't help that he and Bruce Thomas fell out all over again. According to Elvis, Bruce began sabotaging live shows, while from Bruce's recollection, he simply hit the wrong note for the first time, and Elvis took it to mean the worst. Either way, Elvis chewed him out backstage one day, and Bruce just checked out from there. At the end of the tour, they both knew they'd never work together again. In the end, All This Useless Beauty didn't sell, and that seemed to be the final straw for Elvis's time at Warner's. To complete his contract, he recorded the hip-hop influenced The Bridge I Burned as a promotional single for Extreme Honey, the best of the Warner Brothers years. The song was originally planned as a cover of Prince's Pop Life until Prince refused, and the final result feels like a massive piss take to Warner's, the Attractions, and his career at the time. It takes its name from an ad-lib Elvis did while performing You Bowed Down with the Attractions in '96, giving away how much he regretted reforming the band. Once the song and compilation were out, he walked away from them and Warner's with his middle finger held high. The real kick in the pants about the Warner Brothers years and their undignified end is that they began so optimistically. Following Blood and Chocolate in 1986, Elvis parted from both his British and American record labels and spent the first of multiple 3-year gaps without releasing anything new. However, lifelong Beatles fan that he is, he was hired by Paul McCartney to help him co-write a new album, Flowers in the Dirt. Only a handful of their songs ever made it to record, and I think only one with both men singing together, but their demos are now available in the archival version of Flowers. If you like the interplay that Paul had with John Lennon, the demos do capture a similar magic. They're also largely better than the overproduced album versions. Put a pin in that. Accounts differ on how well Costello and McCartney got along, but after their collaboration, both men had a fistful of songs for them to use, just in time for Elvis to sign to Warner Brothers internationally. He approached the label with 5 different ideas for an album, and even the willingness to hire a hit producer to make it sell. Elvis recounts in hindsight, "They told me to make whatever record I wanted. I seem to have elected to make all 5 albums at once. Thus, he entered 4 separate studios around the world, with a handful of session musicians in each. They produced pop-ready singles in London and Hollywood, Irish folk tales of tragedy in Dublin, jazz workouts and heart-bearing soul in New Orleans. With Elvis sharing co-production for the first time, alongside T-Bone Burnett and Kevin Killen, the resulting album is one of Elvis's biggest pop successes. And it's aged interestingly. Number 19, Spike. Spike was actually the first Costello album I ever knew. My dad was a child of the 70s and 80s, especially tuned into new wave and alternative, and he played CDs and cassettes around the house all the time. They Might Be Giants are my favorite band because of him. He was a fan of Elvis, but this was the only CD he had. That's his actual CD from back in the day. So I grew up hearing Veronica. Co-written with Paul McCartney, the song was a US hit in 1989, with an unlikely subject that only grew more relatable as time went on. Elvis wrote it about his grandmother as she succumbed to Alzheimer's, and he and Paul tried to put her story in a more positive, hopeful light. They imagine her brief moments of terrifying lucidity as her true self persevering. The song was on all of our minds as my great-grandmother suffered a stroke in the mid-2000s, and more recently when my grandmother's dementia violently progressed to Alzheimer's in 2020. It's a song that's very near and dear to my heart for all of those reasons, and because it's just a gleaming pop gem. But only a fraction of Spike sounds like Veronica. Out of everything we'll cover on this list, this album has probably the biggest swerves between style and tone from track to track. The pop, jazz, and folk all weave between each other. Nothing has its own designated section. It's also his longest record up to this point, the first to pass a full hour, and the first to have tracks removed from the vinyl because of it. Nothing to do with record label shenanigans like his early records, it was just too long for that format. Elvis never confirmed this, but I imagine the length is due to CDs just starting to overtake vinyl as the dominant music format, which meant you could fit more onto one album. Bands in the 90s overloaded theirs, sometimes to their detriment. It took discipline to pare down an album to its best tracks, and Elvis had carte blanche to eschew discipline if he wanted. Luckily, Spike is so loaded with good material that length is not an issue. It's other things. The album opens with This Town, one of its brightest pop singles, and it's just like Elvis to make it about the bullshit of wealth and industry. But like the off-putting album cover, he observes these many deluded characters, their minds and perspectives hollowed out by success, with a big amused grin on his face. To give you an idea of just how much freedom Elvis had over this production, this track features Roger McGuinn on 12-string and Paul McCartney on bass. And for all intents and purposes, they're just session musicians like everyone else. I have issues with this song's overproduction, same with Veronica. They're washed out and trebly to the detriment of the music. We'll come back to that.
He's so proud of the kick, my heart signed with it, hung on his back and burned.
Then things turn serious. Let Him Dangle is Elvis's first big protest of capital punishment, based around the real trial and execution of Derek Bentley in 1953. Derek led an armed burglary with teenager Chris Craig, and when they were arrested and told to drop their weapons, Derek told Chris, "Let them have it." Whether it's what he meant or not, Chris shot one of the cops dead, and because he was too young for the death penalty, they hanged Derek instead. Elvis tells the story in all of its inexplicability and confusion, raising every question he can about the death penalty's lack of logic, pointlessness, and what it reveals about the people who support it and respond to death by calling for more of it. A couple lyrics were awkwardly phrased to fit the meter, but he treats the subject with all of the seriousness and righteousness it deserves, especially in the face of the people who didn't treat it seriously.
Killing anybody is a terrible crime. Why does this bloodthirsty chorus come round from time to time?
The track is immediately followed by the beautiful, effortless glide of Alan Toussaint's fingers across the piano in Deep, Dark, Truthful Mirror. The Dirty Dozen brass band elevate Costello's croon in a grand bearing of the soul, blending surreal imagery inspired by nature documentaries with the grounded realities of alcoholism and self-reflection. The lyrics become increasingly bizarre with each verse, drawing disjointed images of decay that escalate from fingers bleeding on a fiberglass tumbleweed to a butterfly eating a dead monkey's hand. But Elvis insists in his memoir that the opening lyrics explain the song's intentions.
One day you're gonna have to face the deep dark truth from mirror, and it's gonna tell you things that I still love you too much to say.
It is hard to live with someone who repeatedly hurls himself into the oblivion of alcohol and anger. It's harder still when that person is you or someone you are pretending to love. Such was much of his first marriage when his career took off, when he indulged in vice for creative inspiration while his wife was unawares. He sounds sincerely sorry. It's a shame it took another 16 years and a tragedy before Elvis and Alan worked together again, because they collaborated beautifully. This goes straight back into bright jangle pop with Veronica, and the album only swerves wider from there. We get a relaxed folk stroll with God's Comic, Elvis's first picture of a mundane, unspectacular afterlife. It's steeped in religious satire, from the initial character being an unscrupulous priest dying and meeting God, to the big guy's disappointed fascination with trash culture, and up to him deciding to leave humanity on their own. It's an understated highlight of the album, with Mark Rebo's Spanish guitar and Michael Blair's marimba giving it a Tom Waits feel.
I've been wading through all of this unbelievable junk and wondering if I should have given the world to the monkeys.
Speaking of Tom Waits' feel, Chewing Gum feels like Elvis aiming straight at Tom Waits' style. Mark playing sharp guitar, Michael Blair hitting a metal pipe, and lyrical themes of Orientalism all centered around swordfish trombones or rain dogs. The Dirty Dozen return, and Kirk Joseph handles all of the low end with his sousaphone, giving the song a lot of swing. The lyrics of a Chinese mail-order bride's sexual misadventures with a racist, fetishizing pig haven't aged well. They're a little too self-amused to be satire so much as outright laughing at her situation, but the song is so fucking absurd and stupid, it's hard to take it that seriously.
Now he gives her a picture of marathoner and child. She wants to roll rock as he spills his beer over her, bumps and he grinds as he repeats Bangkok.
This is the album's biggest tonal whiplash, but it's not its last. It goes from Chewing Gum to Tramp the Dirt Down, an angry, heartbroken protest of the Tories' policies and the lives they cost, with Margaret Thatcher at the center of the target. It's like a folk funeral procession, the instrumentation and lyrics dripping with grief but lost for action. Elvis just hopes he lives long enough to see her die. It's a bleak expression, and he got a lot of pushback for it, but it's aged a lot better than the last track. In present day, with old, rotting conservatives grasping desperately for the control that slips more and more through their fingers by scapegoating, demagoguery, legislating thousands of lives out of existence, people of color, trans and non-binary, and otherwise, it's more important than ever to outlive these bastards. I've always loved this song, and it only grows more important to me with every passing year.
Can you imagine all that greed and avarice coming down on that child's lips?
The very middle of the album, or the start of side 2 on the vinyl, is an instrumental, Stalin Maloney. The Dirty Dozen handle a bobbing jazz interlude that did actually have lyrics at first, but they opted to have the instrumental on the album. The Rhino reissue includes the vocal version, a free associative spoken word reading. I like both versions, but compared to everything around it, I feel like this was always just going to be a curious interlude. And again, it's placed very bizarrely between the musically softer but emotionally intense tracks.
They can't tell a cuckoo clock from the squeals of saxophone. That's when they'll feel lightning.
For the most part, side 2 has the majority of the album's strongest tracks. Elvis took inspiration from both Burt Bacharach and the Pretenders for Satellite, and Chrissie Hynde herself provides the harmony in the chorus. It's a deceptively dreamy song about a voyeuristic future of empty pleasures at others' expenses. It almost predicts the internet and campsites especially, though by the time those came around, and especially these days, people are more aware of consent, and also kink. Some people are just into this on all sides. It's the one track with similar washy production to This Town in Veronica that actually makes it work with the song. It enhances that dreamy, drifting atmosphere, like you're up in the sky with a satellite watching these people, indifferent to their sadness. This goes straight into another goofy song, and I'm gonna save that one for last, because it ties into my overall problems with Spike. That then jumps into the tender acoustic lament, Baby Plays Around, one of the album's finest tracks. It was co-written with Elvis's wife, Cotto Reardon, and performed almost entirely by Elvis himself, plus Mitchell Froom on a very quiet organ, and it is heartbreaking. The narrator's partner is either a cheater or a partier, or anything that takes her far away from him for her own pleasures. But she is all he has, so he chooses to accept love's leftovers rather than lose her entirely. Considering Elvis's own history of playing around, you can read this as him putting himself in his ex-wife's shoes. It makes me cry every time.
She's all I have, worth waiting for, but baby plays around.
Miss Macbeth is outwardly silly, but subtly tragic. It was inspired by a dreadful, noisy, and misanthropic set of downstairs neighbors from Elvis's childhood. The song offers some sympathy to those people from a more mature man's perspective. It imagines one of them as the village outcast, a lonely old woman accused of evil when she's just misunderstood, though before long she rises to their bait. The lyrics suggest that the narrator thinks she deserves her derision, but the folk instrumentation, the Dirty Dozen brass band, and the dramatic theatrical tone make the song feel more like mummers parading in celebration of her dishing out the closed-minded villagers' comeuppance.
And every day, sad, another love song. It's a tear for the man of somebody done wrong.
I'm starting to think Elvis broke up the tearjerkers like this because putting them all together would kill someone, because Any King's Shilling destroys me. It was partially inspired by Elvis's grandfather in his time as an Irishman in the British military. It's a picture of humanity in war, a situation inherently indifferent to human life. If this album has one overarching theme, it's the actual humans who have to live through that cosmic indifference. Elvis's voice and the instrumentation make this song soar. If you've never thought Julian pipes could make you cry, listen to this song.
What will become of you? Just isn't worth any king's shilling.
Coltrane Robberies almost has the grit and bite of an Attraction song, a driving rocker protesting the wealthy and hateful stomping down the working class. Benmont Tench plays the most toothsome Vox Continental this side of Steve Naive, though he doesn't have anywhere Steve's presence and flexibility, at least not with what he was told to play.
So you go to the movie, smash it up. You wanna feel your heart pumping that makes you feel good.
It's another strong track, but it does draw attention to how much the Attractions and their strength as a unit elevated Elvis's music. Each musician was to their respective instrument what Elvis is to songwriting. They made his music more than the sum of its parts. We haven't really seen that on this list because it's all his best records. The only times they didn't elevate his music, it was either because of overproduction or amounting to little more than session musicians, all of which also hold back their replacements here on Spike. The standout performances on the album are by the other musicians, the Dirty Dozen brass band and the Irish folk musicians. Benmont is a fantastic keyboardist, but he shines best with Tom Petty, not sitting in Steve Naive's seat. Luckily, the album ends on another acoustic heartbreaker, Last Boat Leaving, about a family on the eve of being torn apart when the father is shipped away to war. All the parents can do is comfort their son while hiding their tears, grief, and regrets. It's up there as one of Elvis's most devastating songs.
And it feels like punishment, but I don't know what for. Take care of your mother, son. It's you that she adores.
There's honestly only one track that I don't like very much, and it's one of the two co-written with Paul McCartney, Pads, Paws, and Claws. It's a playful look at a troubled couple through the lens of animal metaphors in a swinging rockabilly style. The problem is their joint approach to early rock and roll and rockabilly is less Little Richard or Buddy Holly and more,
The tinker, the tailor, the fabulous five, no change jangling.
Bubba Gump Shrimp Co. It at least works better in a context like this that's intentionally amusing.
While he's drinking hairspray, she knows that he never would dare. She could be in pictures if she wasn't all covered in fur.
but putting it right before Baby Plays Around draws attention to my biggest issue with the album on the whole. David Goldstone, writing contemporaneously of the album in his book, took the risk of ranking it among Elvis's very best records. Quote, "It's notoriously difficult assessing a recent work of art. In the past, there are many examples of extravagant praise of works that have later proved to be of little merit, and conversely of critics damning works that have come to be seen as masterpieces. As I write this in the autumn of 1989, I've been familiar with Spike for 9 short months, not long on which to base a judgment which will achieve some kind of immortality in print." Goldstone was also lukewarm on some of Elvis's most beloved albums, so take him with a grain of salt. At the time of filming, I have the benefit of a good 430 more months of hindsight, and while Spike isn't disliked significantly, it is clear how poorly the pop songs have aged. Like Goodbye Cruel World 5 years earlier, these songs are horribly overproduced, buried in thick layers of studio gloss and excess instruments that don't enhance the music, only distract from it. Plus, we have some lovely new late 80s reverb to drown it all out and take away the definition and character from the instruments. It's distracting how much the snare sounds like paper. It's not just me, right? It's hard to tell if this production was a choice by Elvis himself or his co-producers, because sitting right next to the pop songs are folk and jazz that haven't aged a day. T-Bone's and Kevin's skills are both on full display, perfectly clear and rich. Any extra instruments are not excessive or wasted. The Rhino reissue includes Elvis's solo demos, and a lot of those tracks sound better without the excess. Even Pads, Paws, and Claws has a little more grit, and Elvis himself picked Veronica's acoustic demo over the studio version for multiple compilations. Stephen Thomas Erlewine felt that the album is held back by its tonal whiplash, darting rapidly between silly 80s pop songs and serious folk and jazz, and I only agree with him because this undercuts the album's biggest emotional highs. Having Pads, Paws, and Claws next to Baby Plays Around, having Chewing Gum next to Tramp the Dirt Down. But my biggest issue is how much this weird tone problem highlights that the folk and jazz are kicking pop's ass. Spike is at least partially a successor to King of America, both in the personnel and the sound of the folk tracks, and I think in the long run, it should have been that entirely. Obviously, Spike is good enough to get into my top 20 as is, but if Elvis only recorded 1 or 2 of those 5 albums he planned, it could make it to my top 10. At the very least, Elvis himself has a positive outlook on the album. He closes out the reissue liner notes by saying, "I performed most of the songs on Spike many times in concert. I may have played some of them better than on this disc, but there are all sorts of unusual holes in these recordings that I like. I really wouldn't change a note." Like I mentioned, Spike is notable for having one of 2 early collaborations between Elvis and Allen Toussaint. Allen was considered by some to be New Orleans music, a celebrated musician, songwriter, composer, and producer in New Orleans jazz, soul, and R&B, all the way until his death in November 2015. So you can imagine how he felt in August 2005. Hurricane Katrina hit the region, and despite minimal damage at first, soon the levee broke, and flooding devastated the city. Allen was out of town waiting out the storm, like he had many hurricanes before, but was ultimately stranded in New York City during the disaster. It just so happened that Elvis and his wife Diana lived there as well, and they crossed paths with Allen many times at benefits for hurricane relief. Elvis, a longtime fan of New Orleans music and hater of fascists, was furious at the Bush administration's terrible crisis response. He presented the idea to Allen of doing a Toussaint songbook to help with the relief efforts, but the idea expanded from there. They mostly recorded in Hollywood until they could finally return to New Orleans, where they were the first to record in the city since the disaster. Elvis recalls in his memoir,
Allen Toussaint and I were walking across the lobby of a fine but nearly deserted hotel, located just across Canal Street from the French Quarter. An older gentleman had just entered the rear door and was coming towards us when he recognized Allen and stopped in his tracks. His grim expression lit up. He became elated and emotional, grasping and shaking Allen's hand vigorously, as if his very presence were a sign that all was not lost in the shattered city. He didn't speak at first, but his expression said, "If you are back, then we are all back."
Number 18, The River in Reverse, with Allen Toussaint. This album is half covers of old Allen tracks, half new tracks co-written with Elvis, except for the title track written just by Elvis. But it's a tight package thanks to the no-frills approach of Allen's then-producer, Joe Henry, and the talents of their many cohorts backing them up, the Imposters, the Crescent City Horns, and guitarist Anthony Brown. While Allen plays the most piano and is absurdly dexterous on the keys, Steve Naive is right there complimenting him on both piano and organ, and they and the horns shine throughout. I imagine they chose half of these covers for their resonance with recent events, though I think Elvis only directly confirmed one. The opener, On Your Way Down, does serve as a loose thesis for the album, a warning about greed, respect, and karma set over a smooth R&B groove. It's unfortunately Elvis's sloppiest vocal take on the album, which does hamper the otherwise strong first impression.
The same people you misuse on your way up, you might meet up on your way down.
But then we dip straight into the songs chosen just because they're great. Elvis's rougher singing is perfectly suited to the soul-rending, lovesick, hopeless romanticism of Nearer to You, originally written for Betty Harris. Steve rocks the organ throughout, and I love how he, Allen, and Anthony dance around each other. One of my favorites.
Every little thing I do, I'm trying to get closer to you.
But perhaps even better than that is Tears, Tears, and More Tears, one of several songs originally for Lee Dorsey. It's everything true about the last song, aching, longing romanticism and all, except it's a party. The only downside is the horns are so spread out in the mix that they sound a little anemic. It dulls their power. They probably could have been pushed forward, but everything else makes up for it.
Tears, tears, and more tears. I can't help but to keep on crying. Oh, tears, tears, and more tears. I can't get you off of my mind.
Freedom for the Stallion, also originally for Lee Dorsey, might be the most resonant and powerful of the covers. It's a heartbreaking plea for dignity that approaches spirituality from a deeply human-oriented point of view. Elvis notes in the bonus DVD documentary, Putting the River in Reverse, that he wanted to sing it because of its resonance to the tragedy, both the hurricane and otherwise, and it's one of his two best vocal performances on the album.
Because it's a song about dignity, something that seems to be taken away from people in the most alarming way, not just by the natural disasters, but by the man-made disasters that followed on from the natural disaster.
They got men building fences to keep other men out, ignoring maybe whispers and killing them in shouts. Oh Lord, you got to help us find a way.
My other favorite performance of his is All These Things, written for Art Neville, but expanded in the years since, and also a heart-bearing, classic soul love ballad. Elvis actually covered this song for over 2 decades by that point. There's a solo cover on the Rhino reissue of Blood and Chocolate, and here he sounds like he knows it intimately. It's a great use of his weathered but emotive voice, and he puts his all into it. This is a good album for hopeless romantics like me. I'm a sucker for this.
All of my love to you.
And the final cover on the main album is Wonder Woman, another written for Lee Dorsey that turns love into a big celebration. Instead of missing someone, it's shouting how great she is from across town and everyone joining in the parade for this awesome girl. There is one couplet at the start that hadn't aged well, and weirdly it's another song where the horns feel like they could have been brought forward more in the mix, but nothing can stop the song's infectious energy.
She's my Wonder Woman, Wonder Woman. What you can do, it can be done.
That's the charm and effectiveness of these covers that have nothing to do with the hurricane or human mistreatment. They emphasize how good it feels to be alive, and sometimes you need that to get you through a tragedy. Though you'll likely notice that I skipped a cover, and that's for a particular reason that we'll get to near the end. Put a pin in that. After all, Allen's songs and Elvis's voice are known quantities at this point. The hanging question is how they do as collaborators and co-writers. This brings us to The Sharpest Thorn, the first song on the album co-written by both, about a prideful, sharp-dressed man who goes out on parade and comes home humbled. While musically it's almost all Allen, a horn-led waltz that recalls New Orleans marching band tradition, there's no mistaking Elvis's sense of humor and wry approach to religious imagery. The narrator invokes archangels Michael and Gabriel, but gets pickpocketed.
Although we know we must repent, we hit the scene and look the same.
The title track is the only one written solely by Elvis, and you can tell sonically and lyrically. The music is a bluesy vamp, an aching trudge through the flooded streets of New Orleans, howling to the sky in anger and grief about the destruction and the horrible government response. Elvis rejects the angry songwriter label, but this is an example of how good he can be at using anger. It's rooted in unflinching humanity and pointed in the right direction.
So count your blessings when they ask permission to govern with money and superstition. They tell you it's all for your own protection till you feel your own reflection.
Broken Promised Land continues that righteous anger, pointed directly at the nominally Christian grifters and bigots who called New Orleans a place of sin and the hurricane God's punishment. They love that lie, don't they? Elvis turns that inhuman horseshit right back in scathing sarcasm while the band just jams behind him.
Coming in under the cover of darkness, how high shall we build this wall?
Alan mentions in the documentary that his music is steeped in New Orleans, the city and the culture, even the food, and especially the influence of Professor Longhair, who he calls his Bach of rock. So it tracks when the only song on the album that is just Alan on piano and Elvis on vocals, Ascension Day, was developed out of a piece by Professor Longhair, Tipitina, which Alan recently adapted on his last album as Tipitina and Me. In their interview in No Depression, Elvis says that they were, quote, almost too polite when trying to write new music. Nobody would take the lead. But he was so inspired by Tipitina and Me that he went home and wrote lyrics for it in one night. And that broke open the collaboration to include new music. You can hear that in how the song directly faces the grim aftermath of the hurricane and struggles for hope and feeling when tragedy begets numbness. It's a showcase for Alan's talents on piano. He flutters across the keys like a dancer while Elvis pours his soul out.
Thought I heard somebody pleading, thought I heard someone apologize. Some fell down weeping, others pulled their face up at the sky, and those who were left seemed to be wearing disguises.
But like the covers, the originals are not all doom and gloom. International Echo is essentially Elvis giving it up to New Orleans music by recounting how it traveled across the ocean to the UK and inspired him in his youth. It's his chance to give some love back to that music. The tone is celebratory and humorous, and it's just a blast.
Down in the basement, used to fade and spot. Three boys hoping to make their mark into a national echo.
And the album ends with Six-Fingered Man, a funky takedown of probably Bush or Cheney, but generally a greedy, prideful egotist, like the protagonist of The Sharpest Thorn, exaggerated to be immune to humility. The song's ageless, basically. It is an odd choice for a closer, though, because there's nothing really conclusive about its tone or subject. Put a pin in that, too. But it's another jam, and Elvis definitely has fun on vocals.
Is it cheap and slow to apply? If they have a damn seem to be lies, always helps to advertise. Oh, it's never enough.
For what it's worth, I don't think this album is Elvis's strongest showing as a singer overall, aside from the two I pointed out. This is that point in his career when he stopped trying so hard to hit the notes, but he's far from sleepwalking. We've heard what that sounds like. He's putting all of his soul and jazz roots to good use and singing each song with all the passion and love for this music that he has. Rough and tumble Joe Cocker vibes. He just probably could have stood to warm up more before recording. That might be why, for me, the album's highest peak is the one time when Alan takes over on lead vocals. Unpin that. Who's Gonna Help Brother Get Further was another written for Lee Dorsey, but this is easily my favorite version. Alan's voice is silky smooth and effortlessly cool. I love how he and Elvis share a call and response in the chorus, and Big Sam Williams does a ripping trombone solo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's such a good rendition that the documentary plays the entire recording for a scene, and then they added that whole scene as a bonus to the concert DVD from that same year. so nice they did it twice. The lack of Alan's voice on the album is a big missed opportunity, and not just because he's a great singer, but because of something I noticed in the documentary. He and Elvis duet on a version of What Do You Want the Girl to Do, which did not make the final album. At first, it's a case of their different vocal approaches clashing. It's the risk you take when you duet with Elvis.
So you think the woman's crazy, 'cause she eats up your lies like it's good to her.
Eat up your lies like apple pies, and she don't eat them cry.
But then they harmonize on the chorus, and their voices blend great.
What do you want the girl to do? Don't you know you're breaking the child in two?
Alan does sing backup with Davy Farragher throughout the album, but they missed a chance to bring more of that to it. It's a shame. But there is one missing piece that actively annoys me about this album, and it's probably not even its own fault. I talked before about Columbia switching out tracks on Elvis's early albums when bringing them over to the States. Well, in the digital age, you can fuck your audience within the same country. The main album ends with Six Fingered Man, a song I like, but is just not an album closer, while the iTunes and streaming version ends with Where Is the Love as a bonus track. And it is so clearly the album closer. It's written by Elvis and Alan, it's one of the response songs to Katrina, and it ends the album on a somber note that brings the energy down while lyrically hitting hard. It sends the album out by bringing it back to Bush's tragic farce of a rescue that inspired it in the first place.
At best you are a cruel coward. At worst you are a worthless hypocrite.
It's the proper culmination of the album to me. And if you buy the physical disc, you don't get it. The Japanese version also has its own bonus track, another song written for Lee Dorsey, The Greatest Love. As an impassioned heartbreak song, it also works nicely as a closer, if not in a way that feels as completing.
But I found out that you were lying when you said that you'd be mine. All that talk about breakup, never leave me, never.
But if the worst thing I can say about an album is that it deserved at least one more track, it's probably a pretty fucking good album. These guys defied the pain of tragedy with joy as much as anger, in a way only they can. We're really at the point where these rankings are arbitrary, because even though this album just misses the top half of the list, there's no reason for fans to skip it. It holds up and continues to resonate decades after the tragedy that inspired it. Unfortunately. All right, and we're going to call part 1 here, folks. Thank you very much for watching. Apologies again for splitting the video in half, but I just ran out of time. And I wanted to stick to my deadline of October 13th to go alongside the 10th anniversary of Elvis's memoir. But I will finish part 2 and have that uploaded in mid-December, and then I'll combine both parts in January. So you won't have to wait too long for the top half of the list. And who knows, maybe I'll include a special bit in it so you can see the results of my breast augmentation surgery, which will be happening literally 4 days after part 1 goes up. But in the meantime, I've deleted my Patreon and I've moved to Ko-fi. So the link to the new crowdfunder is in the description. Please support the channel if you enjoyed this and if you want access to the Discord and to see early work in progress cuts as I finish them. All right, thanks a lot, everyone.